Every morning the track feels slightly different underfoot, yet also entirely the same, shaped by the night's dampness and the tread of the day before. The ground gives slightly beneath your leather sandals, not enough to be called mud, just a softness that yields and then springs back, leaving a faint print that slowly fills with water the color of weak tea. The moisture seeps up through the stitching, and you feel the coolness reach the soles of your feet, a sensation so familiar that you might not notice it at all if you let your attention drift elsewhere. On either side of the path, the grass bends low under a weight of dew, each blade coated in tiny beads that cling to the green-gray blades and occasionally spill over onto your ankles as you pass. A few stray drops touch your skin and trail down, and you register them only as a slight cool tickle before the next step carries you on. You can see the mist ahead, down where the ground dips toward the brook that you cannot see but can always hear. It is a thin mist, not the heavy fog that sometimes swallows the whole valley, but a shallow layer that hovers just above the earth, moving lazily, as if it has nowhere else to be. The tops of the alder trees rise out of it, their bare winter branches black against the pale sky, and they stand in a line like posts driven into the ground to mark a boundary nobody remembers placing. The mist parts around your legs as you walk into it, swirling briefly and then closing behind you, so that if you turn to look back, the huts would already be half hidden, their thatched roofs softened into a blur of brown and grey. You do not turn back. There is no reason to look behind you when the path always leads the same way. The only sounds are those you make yourself and those that belong to the land. Your footsteps create a soft, wet rhythm, a squelch and a release that repeats with each stride, the pace so regular that after a while you stop perceiving it as separate noises and instead feel it as a kind of steady hum inside your chest. Sometimes a pebble grinds against another under your heel and produces a sharper click, and that single small sound stands out for a moment before dissolving back into the general quiet. Far away, somewhere over the field to your left, a crow calls once, a hollow rasp that travels across the damp air without urgency, as if the bird itself is merely commenting on the morning rather than trying to communicate anything in particular. The call fades, and for a long while there is nothing else except the brush of your own tunic against your knees and the faint, distant gurgle of the brook beneath the bank. The light is beginning to grow now, though you would struggle to point to the exact moment when the darkness lifted. It is a gradual shift, the pale grey of the sky becoming marginally brighter, the mist taking on a whiter quality, the shapes of the bushes and the low stone walls emerging more distinctly from the gloom. You notice a thrush perched on a fence post, its feathers fluffed against the chill, and it watches you pass with one dark eye, but makes no move to fly. You notice the way the wire of the fence has sagged between the posts, and the way the barbed thistles beside it are rimed with moisture, their sharp points glistening. All these details appear without any demand on your attention, offering themselves to you as you walk in a slow, unbroken procession. The path begins to rise slightly, and you feel it in the backs of your calves as the muscles warm and stretch. The incline is so gentle that it hardly qualifies as a hill, just a long swell of the land that lifts you slowly out of the mist and onto higher ground where the air is a fraction drier. As the mist thins and falls away behind you, the tilery comes into view, though it has been there all along, hidden only by the dip in the land and the grey veil of the morning. You see it not all at once, but piece by piece, as if the scene is assembling itself out of the mist. First the dark roof ridge of the main shed, then the paler line of the drying racks beyond, then the squat round shape of the kiln with its narrow chimney pointing upward, and finally the whole low spread of the works beside the open clay pits. The tilery sits on a flat area of ground that was cleared long ago, its boundaries marked by a post and rail fence that is weathered to the same grey-brown as the soil. The main building is a long, low shed with a roof of thick thatch that slopes down almost to the ground on one side and is propped open on the other with sturdy timber posts, leaving the interior half exposed to the air. From the chimney of the kiln, a thin ribbon of smoke rises straight up into the still morning, grey against grey, so faint that you might mistake it for a trick of the light if you did not already know it was there. The smoke does not billow or churn, it simply rises, smooth and unbroken, until it loses itself in the overcast sky. The air carries the smell of it to you now, a dry, earthy scent of wood ash and baked clay that layers itself over the wet green smell of the grass and the clean damp of the mist. You slow your pace without consciously deciding to, letting the walk become an amble as you approach the gate. The gate itself is a simple affair of 5 rough-cut planks nailed to 2 crossbars hung on leather hinges that creak faintly when you push it open, a sound that you have heard so many times it barely registers. The latch is a loop of rope that you lift with one hand, and the wood is cool and slightly rough beneath your fingers, the grain raised by dampness. You step inside and push the gate shut behind you, hearing the soft thud of the plank settling against the post, and then you stand still for a moment just inside the fence, breathing the air of the tilery, letting your body catch up with the change from walking to standing. The yard is quiet. No one else has arrived yet, or if they have, they are somewhere out of sight, perhaps fetching water or gathering kindling. You walk over to the bench that runs along the front of the shed and pick up your wooden paddle from its place on the shelf underneath, where it has lain since you set it down at the end of yesterday. The paddle is a simple tool, a flat blade of beechwood smoothed by use, with a handle that fits your palm exactly because it has been worn to the shape of your grip over many months of pressing. You turn it over once in your hands, checking the edge for splinters, finding none, and then you tuck it under your arm while you take a dipper of water from the barrel beside the door and drink slowly, feeling the cold spread down through your chest. Your tunic clings to your back and shoulders now, the wool heavy with the moisture it has absorbed from the air, and you feel the weight of it as you move, a constant reminder of the damp world you live inside. It is a sensation so ordinary that you hardly think about it, just as you hardly think about the way your sandals have darkened with water, or the way your hair curls a little tighter against your forehead in the humidity. These are simply the conditions of your life, as steady as the seasons, as reliable as the path you walked this morning and will walk again this evening. You set the dipper down and walk into the shed, your eyes adjusting to the dimmer light beneath the thatch. The long workbench stretches away from you, its surface pale and worn, marked with the ghostly outlines of yesterday's tiles. The clay trough sits at the far end, covered with a damp cloth that you will soon peel back. The wooden molds are stacked on the shelf where you left them, their insides faintly dusty with the fine sand you used to prevent sticking. Everything is exactly as it should be, arranged in the same order that you leave it every evening and return to every morning, a pattern so deeply established that it feels less like a choice and more like the natural order of things. You stand in the entrance of the shed for a while, not moving, not thinking of anything in particular, just feeling the cool air move across your face and listening to the distant drip of water from the roof edge into the barrel. The crow calls again, farther away now, and a smaller bird answers from the thatch with a brief chitter that subsides immediately. The smoke from the kiln continues to rise in its slow, vertical column, and somewhere under the ground the last warmth of the previous firing is still cooling, radiating a faint heat that you can sense when you step closer to the kiln's brick wall. But you do not step closer yet. That part of the work will come much later, after the pressing and the drying and the loading. For now there is only the beginning of the day, the quiet moment before the clay touches your hands, the pause that stretches between arriving and starting, and you let it stretch, because there is no reason to rush and every reason to move slowly, deliberately, in the same rhythm that the tiles themselves will follow through every stage of their making. Outside the shed, the mist is almost cleared from the yard, though it still lies thickly in the hollows down by the brook, and the light has strengthened enough to cast faint shadows, pale blue-grey shapes that barely darken the ground. You can see the clay pits beyond the fence, their edges marked by a darker line of exposed soil, and you know that later you will walk down into them with your wooden spade and begin the slow work of digging. But not yet. First you will stand here a little longer, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of the paddle in your hand, letting the day settle around you like the mist settles into the hollows, patient and unhurried, a single quiet thread in the long fabric of the mornings that came before and the mornings that will follow. You leave the workbench and the paddle where they rest and walk out of the shed into the yard, crossing the damp-packed earth that your feet know as well as the path from the huts. The morning has brightened a little more, though the sun is still only a pale smear somewhere behind the seamless grey above, and the world remains muted, soft-edged, without strong shadows. The clay pits lie just beyond the post and rail fence on the northern side of the tilery, 3 shallow depressions cut into the gentle slope where the soil changes color from brown loam to a smooth grey-blue stratum that glistens with trapped moisture. You open the low gate that leads to the pits, a gate smaller than the main one, built of 2 alder poles and a crosspiece, and you step through into the working hollow where the raw material of your days waits for you. The pit you work from most often is the middle one, a rectangular excavation about 20 paces long and 12 wide, its floor a level surface of exposed clay that has been cut back in steps along one edge. The walls of the pit rise to the height of your waist, and the clay within them is layered in visible bands, darker at the bottom where the water gathers slowly, paler near the surface where the air has dried the uppermost skin. Rain from the night before has collected in the low corners, small pools of still water that reflect the grey sky so perfectly they seem like holes in the earth, and you step around them without needing to look, your feet placing themselves on the raised ridges between the pools by habit. The air in the pit is cooler and noticeably damper than the air in the yard, and it carries a clean mineral smell, the smell of wet stone and ancient silt, and the faint metallic tang of iron in the clay itself. You pick up your wooden spade from where it leans against the pit wall, its blade darkened by use, and its handle polished smooth in 2 places where your hands always grip it. The spade is not a digging spade of the sort used for turning garden soil. Its blade is flat and squared off at the end, designed for slicing rather than scooping. You step down onto the clay floor and position yourself at the face where the best grey-blue clay lies, the band that is neither too sandy at the top nor too wet and sticky at the bottom. The clay face before you is faintly glossy from the damp, and when you press your thumb against it, the indentation fills slowly with water, a sign that the material is perfectly workable, neither crumbling dry nor oozing liquid. You push the blade of the spade into the clay with a steady pressure, not stabbing or forcing it, but leaning your weight behind the motion so that the iron edge slices cleanly down through the stratum. The clay parts with a soft wet sound, a kind of hiss and suck, combined, and you feel the slight resistance give way as the blade sinks to its full depth. You work the spade back and forth once, twice, loosening the block, and then you lever it outward with a gentle tilt so that a rectangular slab of clay separates from the pit face and falls onto the flat ground beside your feet, with a quiet, heavy flop. The slab is roughly the size of a loaf of bread, its surfaces smooth and dark where the spade cut them, its edges sharp enough to hold their shape. You set the spade aside for a moment and lift the slab in both hands, feeling the cool weight of it, the way the clay presses against your palms and oozes slightly between your fingers, the way it transfers its chill into your skin until your hands feel as cool and damp as the clay itself. Beside the pit sits a reed basket, a sturdy wide-mouthed container woven from bulrushes and fitted with 2 rope handles. You lower the slab of clay into the basket, laying it flat on the bottom, and then you return to the pit face for another. The second cut goes into the clay just beside the first, the spade finding the same depth, the same resistance, the same smooth slicing sound that you have heard thousands of times before and will hear thousands of times again. One by one, you cut slab after slab, each roughly the same shape and weight, each laid into the basket in a growing stack. The work is repetitive and slow, and your mind drifts into the rhythm of it, the bend and the press and the lever, the lift and the turn and the place, the short walk back to the pit face, the bend and the press again. The morning passes around you without any marker of time except the gradual filling of the basket and the slow accumulation of clay under your fingernails. When the basket is full, heaped with a stack of grey-blue slabs that glisten faintly, you grip the rope handles and lift. The weight is considerable, but you are accustomed to it, and you carry the basket with a steady shuffling walk across the pit floor and up the single shallow step to the grass, then across the yard toward the preparation area. The preparation area is a simple outdoor station set between the clay pits and the shed, consisting of a heavy timber table, a water barrel, and a smaller trough where the cleaned clay will be stored. You set the basket down on the ground beside the table and straighten your back, feeling the stretch across your shoulders. And for a moment, you simply stand still, your hands resting on your hips, your breath slow and even. The robin that sometimes perches on the water barrel is not there today, but the barrel itself is full to the brim from last night's rain, and the surface of the water shimmers slightly as a breeze, too faint to feel, passes across it. You lift the first slab of clay from the basket and place it onto the preparation table. The table is a thick slab of oak, its top worn into a shallow concavity by years of clay being pushed and turned and scraped across it, and its surface is dark with embedded moisture. You take a wooden mallet from its hook on the table's edge and use it to break the slab into smaller lumps, tapping gently rather than pounding, reducing the large block to a collection of fist-sized pieces that will be easier to handle. The clay breaks along natural planes, revealing the small stones and root fibers that are always present. Fragments of the ancient riverbed that deposited this clay long before the tilery was built, and long before anyone thought to cut into this hillside at all. Now you take a bucket and dip it into the water barrel, pouring the cold water over the clay lumps in a slow, controlled stream that soaks into the material, softening it, beginning the process of turning the stiff slabs into a pliable, workable mass. The water pools in the low spots on the table and then gradually sinks in, darkening the clay to near black in the places where it saturates. You watch the absorption happen without impatience, knowing that the water needs time to penetrate, that the clay will tell you when it is ready. While you wait, you wipe your hands on the rag that hangs from your belt, a square of old linen that is perpetually damp and stained the same grey-blue as the clay, and you look out across the yard toward the kiln where the smoke still rises in its unbroken column, as steady now as it was when you arrived. When the clay has softened enough, you begin the work of cleaning it. This is a task that requires no tools except your own hands and your own attention, and it is as repetitive and methodical as the cutting was. You take one lump of the wetted clay and turn it over in your palms, squeezing gently, feeling for the tiny hard points of stones or the stringy fibers of dead roots that must be removed. Your thumbs work across the surface in slow circles, searching, and when you find a pebble, you pinch it out with your fingernails and flick it onto a growing pile of debris at the edge of the table. The pebbles are mostly small, the size of lentils or split peas, smooth and rounded, and they click faintly as they land. The root fibers are thin and dark, fragments of plants that grew and died long before you were born, and they pull out of the clay with a slight tearing sound before you discard them too. You work through each lump in turn, turning and squeezing, your hands moving in a pattern so established that you could perform it in total darkness. The clay gradually becomes smoother under your fingers, more uniform, its texture shifting from crumbly and irregular to something dense and almost silky. As each lump is cleaned, you set it into the trough, patting it down with your palm so that it merges with the lumps already there, forming a continuous mass that you will later knead at the bench inside the shed. The pile of discarded stones and roots grows slowly, a small mound of unwanted material that you will later scatter on the path to fill the muddy spots. The light changes slightly as you work, the grey sky brightening by another imperceptible degree, and you become aware that the mist has completely lifted from the lower fields. Through the gap in the fence you can see the alder trees now clearly, their bare branches sharp against the sky, and beyond them, the patchwork of small fields and hedgerows climbing the opposite slope. The crow flies across that view, a black shape moving slowly from one tree to another, and its call reaches you as a distant, lazy call that seems to confirm how unhurried everything in this valley is, how little reason there is to rush. You continue dipping water and pouring it, slicing and turning, squeezing and picking, until the entire basket of slabs has been processed. The trough is now half full of cleaned clay, a dark, glistening mound that sits beneath its damp cloth cover, waiting for the kneading bench. The table is smeared with wet residue, and you take a wooden scraper and push the smears into a ball, adding it to the trough so that nothing is wasted. The debris pile you gather in your palm and carry to the path, scattering the pebbles and fibers underfoot where they will help firm the ground against the rain. Then you walk back to the water barrel, dip your hands into the cold water and rub them together to wash off the sticky layer of clay that has dried pale grey on your skin. The water in the barrel ripples and settles, and you dry your hands on your linen rag, which is now wetter than before but still serviceable. You stand for a while beside the preparation table, looking down into the now empty clay pit, and you see that the cut you made has left a clean vertical face ready for tomorrow. The pools in the low corners have grown slightly, fed by the slow seep of groundwater, and a single water beetle skims across one of them, its legs dimpling the surface without breaking it. Everything is orderly, everything is ready, and the morning has moved along its quiet track without any interruption or disturbance. The next stage of the work will take you into the shed to the kneading bench, but there is no need to hurry there either, because the clay will not spoil, and the day is long, and the rhythm of the tilery is a rhythm that accommodates stillness and slowness, as naturally as it accommodates motion. You pick up your wooden spade and return it to its place against the pit wall, leaning it at the same angle it always leans, and you lift the empty reed basket and set it beside the spade so that it will be ready when you return tomorrow morning. These small actions of tidying and replacing are as much a part of the work as the cutting and the carrying, and they settle your mind into a state of quiet satisfaction that is not quite happiness, but something close to it. A sense of fitting correctly into a space that was shaped for you. The tilery hums its low, ongoing hum of smoke and dripping water and the occasional creak of timber settling, and you walk slowly back toward the shed, your sandals making the same wet sound on the grass that they made on the path at dawn, your hands clean and cool, your mind empty of any thought beyond the simple knowledge that the clay is ready and the molds are waiting and the day will continue as it began, slow and grey and unbroken. You carry the damp rag and the faint chill of the outdoor air into the shed, stepping under the low thatch where the light softens from grey-white to a muted brown gold, filtered through the haze of play dust that hangs in the still air. The shed is quieter than the yard, insulated by the thick roof and the walls of timber and wattle, and the sounds that reach you from outside arrive as if from a great distance. The distant caw of the crow now a memory, the trickle of the water barrel, a thread of sound so thin you must almost imagine it. Inside this dim, earthy space, the center of your world shrinks to a single heavy bench that stands against the back wall, waiting with the patience of an object that has not moved in a generation. The kneading bench is a slab of oak so old that its surface has been polished to a dull gleam by the pressing and folding of thousands upon thousands of lumps of clay. It is built low and solid, its legs as thick as your thighs, its top marked with a shallow concavity worn exactly where the clay is always worked, a smooth, bowl-shaped depression that cradles each new batch as if the bench itself remembers the shape of the work. The wood is dark with absorbed moisture and oil from countless hands, and it smells faintly of earth and tallow and the ancient sap of the tree it once was. Beside the bench stands a tall jar of water and a small pottery cup, and hung from a peg above is a thin wire stretched between two wooden handles for cutting the clay. You cross the shed floor slowly, your sandals making no sound on the beaten earth, and you set down your paddle on the shelf by the door before approaching the bench. You pull back the damp cloth from the trough that sits at the end of the bench, uncovering the mound of cleaned clay you prepared outside. The clay is dark grey and glistening, its surface smooth where you patted it down earlier, and it has rested long enough to become cool and uniform in temperature. You plunge your hands into the mass and break off a generous lump, lifting it with both palms and carrying it to the concave working area, where it lands with a soft, wet slap that echoes faintly in the quiet shed. The lump is heavy, perhaps 2 stone in weight, and it holds its shape on the bench, its surface glinting under the dim light that filters through the open side of the shed. Before you begin kneading, you take the cutting wire from its peg and draw it gently through the lump, slicing it in half to inspect the interior. The clay parts cleanly, revealing a smooth cross-section the color of storm clouds, and you check for any remaining stones or air pockets that might weaken the tiles later. The clay is pure and even, exactly as it should be, and you set the wire aside and press the two halves back together, sealing the cut with a firm downward push of your palm. Then you bend forward, placing the heels of both hands on the clay, and you begin. The first motion is always a push, a slow and deliberate leaning of your body weight into the clay so that it spreads outward on the bench, flattening into a thick disc. The clay resists with a firm, cool pressure that you feel travel up through your wrists and into your forearms, and then it yields, slipping sideways under your palms in a smooth, controlled glide. You curl your fingers around the edges of the disc and fold them inward, lifting the far side up and over toward you. The motion is natural as turning a page in a book. The clay comes away from the bench with a peeling sound, a soft release, and you press the folded mass down again, leaning into it once more. This is wedging, the first stage of the kneading, and it follows a rhythm that your body learned long ago. Press, spread, fold, press, spread, fold. A slow cycle that repeats without variation and without end. The clay feels cool and alive under your hands. Not cold in an unpleasant way, but cool like the underside of a stone in a stream. A steady temperature that seems to draw the warmth from your skin and replace it with something cleaner and simpler. The texture is dense and slightly sticky, and yet it releases from the wood cleanly because the bench has absorbed just enough moisture to create a perfect surface for working. When you press down, the clay spreads with a faint squishing sound, a wet whisper that is so constant and so quiet that it soon blends into the background of your awareness alongside the rustle of the thatch and the drip of the water barrel. When you fold it back, the clay meets itself with a solid, breathy thump, and you feel the air pockets that might hide inside, splitting and escaping, tiny bubbles that rise to the surface and pop with minute wet clicks that you sense through your fingertips more than you hear. You continue wedging for a long stretch of time that you do not measure and do not think to measure. The motion takes over your body completely, so that your arms and shoulders move without any instruction from your conscious mind, and your thoughts drift free, unmoored, circling lazily around nothing in particular. You notice the way the light shifts slightly on the bench, the way a small fly wanders across a ridge of dried clay on the shelf, the way your breath falls into the same rhythm as your hands. The clay grows softer and more flexible as you work, its color lightening a little from dark gray to a paler dove gray as the moisture distributes evenly through every particle of the sediment. After some time, you step back and lift the wedged clay in both hands, turning it over and testing its readiness. It feels elastic now, alive with a firm bounce that you can detect when you squeeze it gently, and it no longer cracks at the edges when you bend a corner. The surface is smooth and flawless, with a satiny sheen that reflects the faint light in a soft blurred line. You carry the clay to the far side of the bench and set it down, then return to the trough for another lump, which you bring to the concave bowl and begin to wedge in the same slow press spread fold rhythm. The second lump is very like the first, cool and heavy and resistant, and you repeat the motions exactly as you performed them before until the second lump too becomes elastic and smooth and ready for the next stage. When you have wedged 3 large lumps, you move on to the finer kneading that prepares the clay for the molds. This kneading is gentler than the wedging, less about force and more about coaxing the clay into perfect uniformity, and you perform it with the balls of clay you have prepared. You take 1 lump and press it with your knuckles, slowly, working around in a spiral pattern that pushes the clay outward in a circle. Then you fold it back and press again, this time with your thumbs, finding any small inconsistencies and smoothing them away. The motion here is more like a massage, a careful working of the material that requires attention and patience, but no thought, because your hands know the tolerances and the textures better than your mind ever could, and they guide the clay toward its proper state without any instruction from you. There is a deep pleasure in this work, a quiet satisfaction that sits somewhere below the level of conscious emotion, more like a physical sensation of rightness. The clay is so cool and so responsive, transforming under your touch from a raw lump of earth into a refined, obedient substance that will hold any shape you give it. You feel the clay become smoother and warmer under your hands, borrowing heat from your skin at last, and the scent of it rises up to you. A smell of rain and deep soil and ancient rivers that ran long ago and left this fine sediment behind. You breathe it in slowly, and your breathing remains slow as the kneading, as slow as the turning of the world outside. From time to time you dip your fingers into the jar of water and sprinkle a few drops onto the bench or onto the clay itself, just enough to keep the surface from sticking, never so much that the clay becomes slick or slippery. The water beads on the wood and sinks in, and the bench darkens around the drops, while the clay absorbs the added moisture with a soft sigh that is not a sound but a change in texture, a yielding. You continue kneading, working each lump in turn until the trough is filled, not with a single mass, but with a dozen smooth, round balls, each one a perfect beginning for a tile, each one shaped and smoothed and covered, now with a damp cloth to keep them fresh. You pause to rest your hands, flexing your fingers and rotating your wrists, and you notice for the first time that a new sound has begun outside. Rain has started to fall, not heavily but with the steady, gentle persistence of an English drizzle, and it taps against the thatch above your head with a sound like 100 small fingers drumming softly on a cushion. The thatch absorbs most of the impact, so that what reaches you is a muffled, rhythmic patter, a rustling whisper of water on straw that seems to fill the shed without overwhelming it. The sound is immensely calming, a white noise made physical, and it wraps around you as you stand at the bench, your hands still and your breathing slow. You walk to the open side of the shed and look out, seeing the rain fall in fine, straight lines that blur the outlines of the kiln and the fence and the alder trees. The puddles in the clay pit are now spotted with expanding circles, and the grass lies flat and dark under the steady downpour. The air has cooled a little further, and you feel the dampness reach into the shed, a fine mist of moisture that settles on your face and arms and refreshes you without chilling. The robin, which was absent earlier, now flutters under the eaves of the kiln shed, shaking its feathers and settling down to wait out the rain. And you watch it for a while without thinking about it, simply observing the small brown shape as it bobs and preens. After a time you return to the bench, and now you take the clay paddle you had left by the door and place it beside the balls of clay, ready for the pressing that will come later. But first there is the final check, the last pass through each ball to ensure that no air remains and the texture is perfectly consistent. You pick up the first ball and cut it again with the wire, slicing it open and examining the cross-section with a careful eye. The clay is smooth all the way through, without a single bubble or crack, and you press the halves back together and smooth the seam with a wet thumb until the line disappears. One by one, you check each ball, cutting, inspecting, resealing, smoothing, the repetition as steady as the rain on the thatch, as steady as the smoke that still rises unbroken from the kiln chimney, a grey ribbon against a grey sky. Your mind, by now, has become so quiet that the boundary between yourself and the work begins to dissolve. There is no you separate from the clay, no bench separate from your hands, only a single continuous process of kneading and smoothing and checking that has been happening in this shed since before you were born and will continue after you are gone. The clay you hold in your hands came from a hillside that was laid down in a time so distant you cannot imagine it, and it will become tiles that will roof a building you will never see. And the thought of this does not trouble you or excite you. It simply is, as the rain is, as the bench is, as your own breathing is. You finish checking the last ball of clay and cover the trough carefully with the damp cloth, tucking the edges under so that the moisture will not escape. The cloth is stained with old clay marks, overlapping grey fingerprints that map the work of many days, and you smooth it down with your palm, feeling the firm round shapes of the clay balls beneath. Then you take a smaller cloth and wipe down the bench, gathering the stray crumbs of dried clay and dropping them into a bucket that will later be emptied into the clay pit to be reabsorbed into the earth. The rain continues to fall, perhaps a little heavier now, and you hear it begin to drip through a small hole in the thatch on the far side of the shed, a steady plink, plink, plink that adds a new note to the soft percussion of the storm. You make a mental note to patch that hole when the weather clears. And then you let the thought go, because there is no urgency in it. The water drips into a shallow dent in the earthen floor that was already there, and you place a small pottery shard under it to guide the drip toward the edge of the shed, and the sound changes to a different pitch, a slightly higher plink that mingles with the other sounds without discord. You stand beside the bench for a long while, listening to the rain and the drip and the distant hiss of the kiln, and you feel a deep, quiet weariness that is not exhaustion but contentment, the kind of tiredness that comes from slow, methodical work done well. Your hands are stained grey now, the clay worked deep into the lines of your palms and under your nails, and you know that no amount of washing will completely remove it, that the clay will remain with you as a pale shadow on your skin for the rest of the day and into the night. This is a fact of your life, a small, ordinary permanence that you accept without thought, and you rub your fingers together idly, feeling the slight grittiness of the dried clay powder that clings to your skin. The light outside is dimming slightly now, though whether from the thickening rain or the slow approach of evening you cannot tell, and you walk to the door of the shed to look out at the tilery one more time, before you move on to the next stage of the work. The yard is a mirror of puddles reflecting the grey sky, and the smoke from the kiln is now barely visible, dissolved into the falling rain. The alder trees sway slightly in a breeze that has risen to accompany the storm, and their branches make a low, creaking sound that you feel more than hear, a vibration in the damp air. Everything is wet, everything is grey, everything is still, and the world outside the shed seems to be holding its breath, waiting for the rain to pass. Though the rain shows no sign of passing any time soon, you turn back to the bench where the covered trough of clay balls waits under its damp cloth, and you place your paddle on top of the trough so that it will be ready when you begin pressing. The shed is dim and warm now, the air heavy with moisture and the smell of wet thatch and clay and old wood, and it feels like a refuge, a small pocket of calm in the midst of the rain-swept valley. You lean against the edge of the workbench, your elbows on the warm wood, and you let your eyes rest on the row of wooden molds stacked on their shelf, each one a dark rectangle waiting to be filled. The next stage of the work is already in your mind, a shadow of the movements you will make, but you do not rush toward it. Instead you remain where you are, listening to the rain tap the thatch and the drip blink into the pottery shard, and the slow, distant murmur of the kiln, letting the quiet fill you up until there is nothing left but the sound and the stillness and the cool, patient presence of the clay. The rain has not stopped, and it drums against the thatch with the same soft, insistent rhythm, a sound so steady that it has become less a noise and more a texture in the air. You stand at the bench for a while longer, letting the quiet settle around you, before you push yourself gently away from the worn wood and turn toward the shelf that runs along the back wall of the shed. On that shelf the wooden molds are stacked in a neat pile, each one a dark rectangle of oak that has been oiled and sanded and used so many times that the corners have blunted and the grain has risen in fine, velvety ridges. You lift the stack down in both hands and carry it to the workbench, setting the molds down with a solid, muffled clunk that seems louder than it is in the silence of the shed. There are 12 molds in the stack, one for each tile you will press in a batch, and you separate them now with a slow, careful motion, sliding each one off the pile and placing it face up on the bench. The molds are shallow trays, each carved from a single piece of wood so that the grain runs uninterrupted from one end to the other, and inside each tray is a rectangular cavity that is exactly the length and width and thickness of a finished roofing tile. The cavities are smooth and regular, their inner walls sloping outward just slightly, so the clay will release cleanly, and their bases are flat and true, without warps or hollows. You run your thumb along the inside of the first mold, feeling the cool, silky surface that years of sand and clay have burnished to a dull gloss, and you nod slightly to yourself, satisfied that the mold is ready. The bronze stamps are kept in a small wooden box on the same shelf, a box with a sliding lid that you open now with one finger. Inside, nestled on a scrap of fleece, lie the stamps, thin tablets of bronze, no larger than your thumbnail, each one cast with the letters of the workshop's mark in reverse, so that the impression will read correctly on the clay. The letters are short and simple, a few strokes that identify the tilery for the merchant who will sell the tiles, and you take the stamps out one by one, counting them against the row of molds until you have 12 in your palm. They are cool to the touch, cooler than your skin, and cooler than the wooden molds, and they make a faint clicking sound as they knock against one another in your cupped hand, a sound like tiny pebbles rattling in a jar. Into the bottom of each mold you place a single stamp, positioning it carefully with the tips of your fingers so that it lies flat against the wood and the letters face upward. The stamps are thin enough that they will not disrupt the shape of the tile, just thick enough to leave a crisp, shallow impression in the underside of the clay, and you press each one down gently to ensure it does not shift when the clay is packed on top. The placement must be consistent, always in the same corner of the mold, always the same distance from the edges, because the mark is part of the tile's identity and must be legible and uniform. You move along the row of molds, dropping a stamp into each cavity with a tiny plink, adjusting it with the nail of your thumb, and when all 12 are placed, you step back and look at them, a dozen dark rectangles each, with its small bronze square, glinting dully in the dim light, and everything is orderly and correct. Now you check each mold for splinters, because wood that has been wet and dried many times can lift fine slivers along the grain, and a splinter would mar the surface of the tile or cause it to stick and tear when it is unmalted. You take up the first mold and hold it close to your eyes, turning it slowly so the faint light from the open side of the shed falls across the surface, and you look for any pale lines or raised fibers that might catch on the clay. Your fingers trace the inside of the cavity, moving with the slow, careful attention of a blind person reading a face, and you feel nothing but smooth, cool oak. You set that mold aside and pick up the next and the next, turning and tracing, a patient inspection that requires no hurry and no thought beyond the simple sensory act of feeling for roughness and finding none. The molds are in good condition, as you knew they would be, but the checking is part of the ritual, a small gesture of care that keeps the work steady and the tiles flawless. Beside the bench, on a low stool, sits a clay jar with a wide mouth, and inside the jar is the fine sand you used to dust the molds. The sand is not ordinary river sand, which would be too coarse and might scratch the wood, but a special sand made from crushed fired tiles, ground in a stone mortar until it is as fine as flour and sifted through a linen cloth to remove any grit. Its color is a warm terracotta pink, the only bright color in the whole grey and brown world of the tilery, and when you lift the lid of the jar the scent of old, dry clay drifts out, a smell like a sun-baked road in high summer. You dip a small wooden scoop into the jar and lift out a heap of the powder, holding it carefully as you move to the first mold. The dusting is a delicate task, requiring a light hand and a steady eye. You tip the scoop just slightly and tap it with your forefinger, so that a thin cloud of pink powder falls into the mold, settling across the wooden base and the bronze stamp in a fine, even layer. The powder clings to the wood, filling the microscopic pores and creating a barrier that will prevent the wet clay from sticking when it is pressed and later released. You blow gently across the cavity, not with force but with a soft, controlled stream of breath that spreads the powder into the corners and lifts away any excess, leaving only a faint, dusty bloom that dulls the shine of the oak. The excess powder drifts into the air and hangs there for a moment, a tiny pink haze that catches the light and then fades, settling onto the bench and the floor and the shoulders of your tunic like the softest of colored snows. You move along the row, dusting each mold in turn, tapping the scoop, blowing the powder into the corners, watching the terracotta blush cover the dark wood one rectangle after another. The repetition is calming, a slow, methodical progression that occupies your hands and lets your mind drift into the same peaceful blankness that always comes during this part of the work. The sounds of the shed accompany you. The rain on the thatch, the drip from the patched hole into the pottery shard, the distant low breath of the kiln, and now the soft tap of the wooden scoop against the rim of the jar, and the gentle puff of your breath that is so quiet it can barely be heard. The world outside the shed might as well not exist. Everything that matters is here, contained within this small, dim space, arranged in a neat row of 12 sandy molds. When all the molds are dusted, you set the scoop back into the jar and wipe the pink residue from your fingers with the rag at your belt, and then you stand back and survey the bench. The 12 molds stretch out in a tidy line, their interiors pale with powder, and their bronze stamps glinting through the pink haze, each one identical to its neighbor, each one ready to receive the ball of kneaded clay that will become a tile. The sight is deeply satisfying in a way that has nothing to do with pride or achievement, and everything to do with order and readiness, with the sense of having completed a necessary preparatory step correctly and completely. You walk over to the trough where the balls of clay wait under their damp cloth, and you lift the cloth just enough to check that the clay is still moist and pliable. The balls gleam in the dim light, their surfaces smooth and cool, and you press a fingertip into the nearest one, feeling the firm elastic resistance that tells you the clay is exactly right, neither too wet nor too dry. You replace the cloth and turn back toward the molds, and as you do, a small movement catches your eye. A drop of rain has found its way through the thatch in a second spot, a tiny leak that beads and falls onto the earthen floor with a soft, dark splat. You make another mental note to check the roof when the weather clears, and then you let the thought go, because it is a small thing, an ordinary thing, and there is no urgency in it. The shed is growing darker now, not with the darkness of night, but with the deepening of the cloud cover, the sky outside shifting from pale grey to a heavier, more layered grey that promises rain for many hours yet. The air inside the shed feels thicker, saturated with moisture, and the smell of the oak bench and the wet thatch and the dry clay powder all blend into a single, complex scent that is the scent of your working life. You stand at the bench with your hands resting on the edge, your fingers just touching the nearest mold, and you listen to the rain and the drip, and the soft, distant rumble of the kiln, letting the quiet stretch out around you like a blanket. The bronze stamps sit inside their sandy beds, and you think for a moment about the letters on them, the mark of this tilery that will be pressed into hundreds of tiles before the season is over. The mark is small and unobtrusive, but it carries with it the reputation of the workshop, a quiet assurance that the tile is sound and well made and will keep the rain out from many winters. You do not think about this in words so much as in a vague, wordless awareness that your work matters to someone, somewhere, even if you will never meet them or see the roof your tiles will cover. The thought passes through your mind like the pink dust passed through the air, gentle and brief, and then it is gone, leaving behind only the familiar, comfortable stillness. You pick up one of the molds and tilt it toward the light, checking the placement of the stamp one final time, and you see that the powder has settled evenly and the bronze letters are clean and sharp. The mold is ready. You set it down and pick up the next, tilting and checking, a final inspection that is perhaps unnecessary but is part of the pattern. A small closing of the loop before the pressing begins. Each mold is exactly as it should be, and you feel a quiet satisfaction in that fact, a sense of completeness that is rare and precious in a world where so many things shift and change and break. When all 12 molds have been checked, you arrange them again on the bench, nudging each one into its proper place so that the spacing is even and the row is perfectly straight. This small attention to alignment is not demanded by the work, but it pleases some deep part of you, some instinct for order that is as natural as breathing. The molds sit shoulder to shoulder now, their sandy cavities glowing pale pink in the dusk of the shed, and you step back one final time to take in the full arrangement: the bench, the trough, the paddle, the molds, the stamps, the powder jar, the rag, all of it arranged in a quiet, orderly composition that is the still life of your daily world. The rain outside continues to fall, perhaps a little lighter now, the drops smaller and more numerous, a fine drizzle that hisses against the grass and the thatch with a sound like a long, soft exhalation. The robin under the kiln eaves shakes its feathers again and tucks its head under its wing, settling in for the duration of the storm, and the smoke from the kiln chimney still rises in its slow, unbroken column, grey against the darker grey of the sky. The day is moving toward its later hours, though you have no way of knowing the exact time and no need to know it. The work will progress at its own pace, as it always does, and the hour of returning home will arrive when it arrives. You take a final action before you move on to the pressing. You dip your fingers into the water jar and flick a few drops over the dusty molds. Just a light sprinkle that will help the powder adhere and create an even smoother surface for the clay to rest against. The drops speed on the powder and sink in slowly, darkening the terracotta to a deeper rose color, and you watch them absorb with the same patient attention you have given every small step of the morning. Then you dry your hands on the rag, leaving fresh pink stains on the old linen, and you turn toward the trough of clay balls that wait under their damp cloth. Everything is ready. The molds lie in their tidy row, the stamps sit in their sandy beds, the powder clings in an even layer, and the clay is cool and pliable and waiting. The next stage of the work, the pressing, will begin soon, but for now there is a pause, a small space of stillness between the preparation and the action, and you let that space exist without trying to fill it. You stand at the bench in the dim, rain-filled shed, your hands resting lightly on the wood, your breath slow and deep, your mind as quiet and empty as the grey sky above. The molds wait, and you wait with them, patient and unhurried, in the soft, steady heart of the tilery. You stand at the bench with the quiet of the shed wrapped around you, the rain still falling beyond the open side in a steady, soundless curtain, and you look down at the row of 12 prepared molds, their sandy interiors pale and waiting. The bronze stamps glint through the terracotta dust, and the balls of kneaded clay rest under their damp cloth in the trough, cool and firm and ready. There is no signal to begin, No bell or call, only the internal sense that the moment has come to move from preparation into the pressing. And you reach for the first ball of clay with both hands, lifting it gently and carrying it to the end of the row. You cup the clay in your palms, feeling its weight and its slight give as your fingers press into the surface, and you lower it carefully into the first mold. The clay settles into the rectangular cavity with a soft, wet, settling sound, a kind of muffled squish that fades immediately, and it bulges slightly over the edges, still too full and too uneven to be called a tile. You adjust the position with small nudges of your thumbs, centering the mass so that it fills the mold from corner to corner, and then you pause for a moment, your hands resting on the clay, feeling its cool smoothness beneath your fingertips. The mold is cool too, the oak and the sand and the bronze all at the same steady temperature, and the contrast between the damp clay and the dry powder is a faint, pleasant grit that you notice only in passing. Now you begin to press. You place your thumbs in the center of the clay and push outward toward the edges, spreading the material into the corners of the mold. The clay responds with a slow, deliberate movement, oozing under your thumbs like thick honey that has been chilled, and you feel it fill the sharp angles of the rectangle, pressing against the wooden walls and the bronze stamp beneath. Your motion is steady and circular, your thumbs describing a series of spirals that work from the middle outward, ensuring that every corner is packed and no air remains trapped underneath. The sensation is deeply familiar, the resistance of the clay against your thumbs, the way it yields and then firms as it compacts, the way the excess bulges up between your fingers and over the rim of the mold. When the clay is spread evenly across the base of the mold, you reach for your wooden paddle. The paddle lies on the bench beside the molds, its flat blade of beech wood smoothed by use, its handle warm from your earlier grip, and you lift it with one hand while the other holds the edge of the mold steady. You place the blade of the paddle flat against the surface of the clay, aligning it with the rim of the mold, and you press down with a firm, even pressure that squeezes the clay into every hollow and flattens the top perfectly level with the wooden edges. The paddle glides across the clay with a soft, scraping sound, a gentle shush that is somewhere between a whisper and a hiss. And as you draw it toward you, the excess clay peels away from the surface and collects on the blade in long, curling ribbons. You scrape the excess clay from the paddle with your thumb, dropping it back into the trough where it can be reworked and used again, and then you inspect the surface of the clay in the mold. It is now smooth and flat, a perfect grey plane that reflects the dim light in a single unbroken gleam, and the corners are sharp and clean, filled without gaps or bubbles. You run the paddle across the surface one more time, a final light stroke that polishes the clay rather than removing any more, and then you set the paddle down and wipe your hands on your rag, leaving fresh grey streaks among the pink stains and the old dried clay marks. The first mold is complete, and you slide it gently to the left side of the bench, making room for the next. Then you turn to the trough and lift the second ball of clay, carrying it to the next mold in the row, and you lower it in the same careful way, feeling it settle with the same soft, wet sound. Your thumbs find the center and push outward, spreading, packing, filling the corners, the motion identical to the one you just performed, your body slipping into the rhythm as easily as a boat slips into a current. The paddle scrapes, the excess peels away, the surface gleams, and you slide the second mold to stand beside the first, two dark rectangles, now holding two smooth grey tiles in their sandy beds. The third mold follows, and the fourth, each one receiving the same unhurried attention, the same slow press of thumbs and scrape of paddle, the same quiet inspection before it is set aside. By the fifth mold, the rhythm has become automatic, your hands moving through the sequence without any conscious direction, while your mind drifts into a calm, empty state, where there is nothing but the feel of the clay and the sound of the paddle and the steady, soft percussion of the rain. The rain has lightened slightly, and now it falls as a fine drizzle that hisses against the grass and patters on the thatch with a sound like 1,000 tiny seeds being scattered on a drumhead, a sound so constant that it blends into the background of your awareness and becomes part of the rhythm of the work. The sixth mold brings you to the middle of the row, and you pause for a moment to flex your fingers, which have begun to feel the slight ache of repeated pressure. The ache is not unpleasant, more like a gentle warmth that spreads through your hands and wrists, a reminder that you are alive and working, and you rub your palms together to brush off the clinging crumbs of half-dried clay before you continue. You notice that the light in the shed has shifted slightly, the grey outside deepening a shade as the afternoon wears on, and the interior of the shed is now dimmer, the benches and the trough and the shelf of tools all softened into shadow. But the dimness does not hinder you. Your hands know the molds too well, and they find the clay and the paddle and the corners, without any need for bright light. You take the 7th ball of clay and lower it into the 7th mold, and as you press your thumbs into the cool, yielding material, you find yourself thinking about nothing at all. The thoughts that sometimes drift through your mind during the kneading have faded now, replaced by a pure, wordless attention to the sensation of the work. The clay is slightly cooler than before, the air in the shed a degree chillier as the afternoon deepens, and you notice this only as a subtle shift in the texture, a fraction more resistance under your thumbs, a fraction more firmness in the way the clay holds its shape. You adjust without thinking, pressing a little harder, spreading a little more slowly, and the tile that forms under your hands is as perfect as the 6 that came before. When you reach the 10th mold, your back has begun to feel the strain of leaning over the bench, and you straighten up for a moment, rolling your shoulders and stretching your neck. The crack of your spine is a small, satisfying sound, and you exhale slowly, letting the tension of the forward-leaning posture drain away. You look out through the open side of the shed at the grey world beyond, and you see that the mist is beginning to creep back across the lower fields, a pale veil that hides the alder trees and the brook and the distant hedgerows. The kiln chimney still sends up its thin ribbon of smoke, which rises straight for a few feet and then bends slightly to the east as it catches a breeze that you cannot feel at ground level, and you watch it for a while, your eyes resting on the slow curling movement that is the only thing in the landscape that moves with any speed. The rest has been enough, and you return to the bench, lifting the 11th ball of clay and settling it into the 11th mold. The pressing continues, the same spiral of thumbs, the same smooth scrape of the paddle, the same soft gleam of the finished surface, and by now the motion has become so deeply ingrained that it feels less like work and more like a kind of breathing, a necessary and natural rhythm that your body performs on its own. The 12th and final ball of clay is slightly smaller than the others, and you notice this when you place it in the mold and find that it does not quite fill the cavity. You return to the trough and pinch off a small piece from the excess you scraped earlier, a piece no bigger than a walnut, and you press it into the gap, working it into the main mass with your thumbs until the seam disappears and the clay is uniform. Then you paddle the surface flat, and the 12th tile is complete. Now all 12 molds sit in a neat cluster on the left side of the bench, each one holding a smooth, flat tile. The surfaces all identical in their pale grey gleam. The bronze stamps are hidden now, buried beneath the clay, but you know they are there, pressing their faint marks into the underside of each tile as it begins its slow drying. You stand back and survey the row, and the sight is one of deep, quiet satisfaction, a sense of completion that has nothing to do with achievement, and everything to do with order. 12 tiles, each one the same size and shape, each one formed by the same hands and the same paddle, each one ready for the next stage of its journey. You pick up the paddle and wipe it clean with the rag, removing the thin film of clay that has clung to the blade, and then you carry it to its shelf by the door and set it down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the shelf as you always do. Then you return to the bench and take the cutting wire from its peg, not because you need to cut anything, but because a stray crumb of clay has dried on the bench and you want to scrape it off. You draw the wire gently across the wood, and the crumb lifts away and falls into the bucket, and the bench is clean again. These small acts of tidying are part of the rhythm too, the closing of the loop that began when you first picked up the paddle this morning. The rain has all but stopped now, and the dripping from the thatch has slowed to a single intermittent plink in the pottery shard, with long silences between each drop. The air outside smells fresh and cool, the dust of the tilery washed away by the hours of drizzle, and a slight breeze moves through the open side of the shed, carrying the scent of wet grass and wet wood and the distant faint sweetness of the first spring flowers somewhere down in the valley. You breathe it in deeply, letting the clean air fill your lungs and clear the last of the clay dust from your nose and throat, and you feel a momentary lightness, a sense of having completed something small but real. The tiles in their molds are still soft, still wet, and they must now be lifted out and set on the drying trays. But that is a separate stage of the work, and there is a pause here between the pressing and the turning out, a natural break that you have learned to respect. You run your fingers lightly over the surface of the nearest tile, feeling the cool, damp smoothness that will soon begin to firm as the moisture slowly leaves the clay, and you trace the faint line where the paddle made its final pass, a line barely visible but detectable to your touch. The clay is flawless, without cracks or bubbles or thin spots, and you nod once to yourself before turning away. You walk to the doorway of the shed and stand looking out at the yard. The puddles in the clay pit have grown larger and now reflect the pale grey sky in wide, still mirrors, and the grass around the fence is bent flat by the weight of the water. The robin has left its perch under the kiln eaves, and a single magpie now stands in its place, its black and white feathers slick with moisture, its head cocked to one side as it watches you with one bright eye. You watch it back without moving, and after a moment it flutters down to the ground and begins to walk across the yard in a series of jerky hops, pecking at the earth for worms that the rain has driven to the surface. You watch it pecking and hopping until it disappears around the corner of the kiln, and then you turn back into the shed, your mind empty and calm. The 12 molds wait on the bench, and your wooden paddle waits on its shelf, and the day continues to pass in its slow, grey, unhurried way. You lean against the doorpost, one shoulder against the rough timber, and you let your eyes rest on the row of tiles, the pale grey surfaces barely visible in the dimming light, and you feel the contentment that always settles over you at this point in the work, the quiet peace of having pressed 12 tiles and knowing that 12 more will follow, tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. The tilery hums its low, steady hum, the smoke rises, the water drips, and the soft clay in the molds slowly begins to dry. The 12 filled molds rest on the bench in their tidy cluster, each one holding a tile that is still soft and damp, glistening faintly under the dim light of the shed. You stand beside them for a moment, your hands resting at your sides, feeling the quiet weight of the work you have just completed, and the work that still lies ahead. The rain has stopped entirely now, and the only sounds are the occasional drip from the thatch and the distant murmur of the kiln, a low, steady breath that never quite falls silent. The air is cool and fresh, washed clean by the long hours of drizzle, and it carries the scent of wet earth and wet straw and the faint, dry tang of the powdered clay that still dusts the bench. You move to the first mold in the row, the one you filled earliest, and you place your fingertips on the rim of the oak frame. The wood is cool and slightly damp from the moisture of the clay, and your fingers find the familiar grip without thought. You lift the mold carefully, cradling it in both hands, and you turn it over with a slow, deliberate motion, so that the open face now points downward toward the wooden board that waits on the bench. The board is a broad, flat plank of alder, its surface sanded smooth and rubbed with a little of the same terracotta powder to prevent sticking, and it sits ready to receive the tiles one by one. With the mold inverted, you hold it just above the board and tap it gently against the wood, a light rhythmic tapping that you feel travel up through your wrists. The taps are not sharp or forceful but soft and patient, a series of small knocks that coax the clay rather than command it. On the third tap you feel the subtle shift inside the mold, a slight loosening as the sandy parting layer does its work and the clay tile begins to separate from the oak walls. You tap once more, and the tile slips free with a quiet wet release, landing face down on the board with a soft, muffled flop. The bronze stamp that was hidden beneath is now visible, its faint impression pressed into the underside of the tile, and you see the letters of the workshop mark standing out crisp and clear, reversed now to read correctly on the clay surface. You set the empty mold aside and turn your attention to the tile. It lies on the board with its smooth, paddle-finished face against the wood and its stamped underside facing upward, still carrying the texture of the mold's inner surface, a fine velvety grain that will fade as the clay dries. The edges are slightly ragged where the excess clay was scraped away, and a thin, almost transparent lip of clay overhangs the corners, remnants of the pressing that must now be trimmed. You reach for the trimming tool that hangs from a small hook on the edge of the bench. A thin strip of bronze no longer than your hand, its edge sharpened to a fine, dull blade that can cut the soft clay without tearing it. You lift the tile from the board with both hands, cradling it as you would a fragile object, and you carry it to the end of the bench, where the light is a little better. The tile is heavy and cool, and it holds its shape firmly despite its wetness, the clay having been wedged and kneaded to just the right consistency. You set it down on a clean patch of the bench and begin to trim. The bronze strip moves along the edges of the tile with a smooth, controlled motion, slicing off the thin, overhanging lip in long, curling ribbons that fall away onto the bench. The blade makes a faint, whispering sound as it passes through the clay, a sound like a finger drawn across wet paper, and you work slowly around all four sides, turning the tile with your free hand, so that each edge is presented to the blade in turn. The corners require special attention, and you use the tip of the bronze strip to neaten the angles, pressing lightly to remove the small burrs that form where the edges meet. The clay here is slightly thicker, and the blade bites into it with a soft, clean resistance, leaving behind a crisp, sharp corner that will hold its shape through the drying and the firing. You blow gently across the trimmed edges to remove any loose crumbs, and the tiny particles of clay scatter across the bench, joining the dusting of terracotta powder that already coats the wood. When the first tile is trimmed, you lift it again and carry it to the large wooden tray that sits on a trestle near the door of the shed. The tray is a broad, flat board with low raised edges to prevent the tiles from sliding off, and its surface is dusted with the same fine terracotta powder. You lay the tile down carefully on the tray, placing it face up so that the smooth, paddle-finished side catches the light, and you align it with the corner of the board, nudging it gently until it sits straight and square. This first tile is the beginning of the batch that will be carried to the drying shed, and you pause for a moment to look at it. A single grey rectangle resting on the pale wood, its edges clean and its surface flawless. Then you return to the bench and pick up the second mold, turning it over with the same slow care, tapping it against the board with the same soft rhythm until the tile releases. The second tile is identical to the first, its stamped underside bearing the same crisp letters, its edges needing the same neatening. You trim it as you trimmed the first, moving the bronze strip along each side with the same steady pressure, and then you carry it to the tray and lay it beside its neighbor, aligning it so that a thin, even gap separates the two. The gap is important because the tiles must not touch while they dry, or they will stick together and tear when separated later. And you measure the space by eye, adjusting the second tile with small, precise nudges until it sits perfectly parallel. The third mold, the fourth, and the fifth follow in the same unhurried procession. You turn each mold, tap it gently, and catch the falling tile with the board, then lift it, trim it, and carry it to the tray. The motions have become a rhythm now, a slow, steady sequence that repeats without variation, and your body moves through it as smoothly as water flowing over stones. The soundscape of the shed accompanies you, the soft thud of the mold against the board, the wet release of the clay, the whisper of the bronze blade, the quiet footsteps across the beaten earth floor, the gentle click of tile meeting wood as you lay each one in its place on the tray. By the sixth tile, the tray is half full, a row of grey rectangles stretching across the pale wood in a tidy line. You pause for a moment to wipe your hands on the rag at your belt, removing the sticky residue that has built up on your fingertips, and you flex your fingers to ease the slight stiffness that comes from holding the trimming tool. Your back has begun to feel the strain of the repeated bending and lifting, and you straighten up and roll your shoulders, letting the tension drain away before you continue. Outside the shed, the world is still and quiet, the grey sky unbroken by any patch of blue, the grass flattened and dark with moisture, the alder trees motionless in the windless air. You pick up the seventh mold and turn it over, tapping it to release the tile. And as you do, you notice that this tile is slightly stickier than the others, the clay having absorbed a fraction more moisture from the air during the pressing. The release is still clean, but the tile clings to the mold for a moment longer, requiring an extra tap before it falls free. You inspect the surface and find no damage, no tearing or distortion, and you proceed with the trimming, taking care to use a lighter touch with the bronze blade so that the wetter clay does not drag or smear. The blade glides over the surface with a slightly different sound, a softer, wetter whisper, and you adjust your pressure without thinking, your hands adapting to the subtle change in the material with the ease of long practice. The 8th and 9th tiles release cleanly, and you trim them and add them to the tray, the row now stretching almost the full length of the board. You notice that the terracotta powder on the tray has begun to transfer to the undersides of the tiles, giving them a faint pink blush along the stamped letters, and you make a small adjustment, dusting the empty space on the tray with a fresh pinch of powder from the jar before laying down the next tile. The powder settles in a fine, even layer, and the tile you place on it sits securely, its stamped surface absorbing just enough of the powder to create a non-stick barrier. When you turn over the 10th mold, you encounter a small problem. The tile does not release after the usual 3 or 4 taps, and you feel the resistance through the mold, a slight suction that holds the clay against the wood. You stop tapping and turn the mold upright again, peering inside to see if a piece of debris is lodged between the clay and the oak. But the cavity is clean, and the sand-parting layer is intact. The clay has simply stuck a little more firmly than usual, perhaps because that particular ball was slightly wetter, and you tap the mold again with a little more patience. A series of soft, persistent knocks that gradually break the seal. The tile slips free at last, and you inspect it carefully, turning it over in your hands to check for any cracks or thin spots. The tile is perfect, its surface unblemished, and you carry it to the tray with a quiet sense of relief that is not dramatic or loud, but simply a small, internal easing. The 11th tile presents no difficulties, and the 12th and final tile releases as smoothly as the first. You trim the last edges with the bronze strip, working slowly around the rectangle, and you carry the tile to the tray, laying it at the end of the row. Now the tray is full. 12 tiles arranged in a straight, even line, their grey surfaces gleaming dully, their stamped undersides facing upward where they will begin to dry. You stand back and look at them, and the sight is satisfying in the same quiet way that the filled molds were satisfying, a sense of order and completion that needs no words. You set the trimming tool back on its hook and wipe the bronze blade clean with a corner of your rag, removing the thin film of clay that has dried on the metal. Then you wash your hands in the bucket of water that stands beside the bench, dipping them into the cool, cloudy liquid and rubbing them together to remove the clay from your palms and fingers. The water darkens with the silt, and you dry your hands on a fresh part of the rag, noting that the old linen is now more clay than cloth and will need to be rinsed in the brook before the day is over. Now you turn your attention to the tray, the broad board of alder with its cargo of 12 trimmed tiles. You bend and grip the edges of the tray, testing its weight, and you find it heavy but manageable, the tiles adding a solid compact density that you feel in your arms and shoulders as you lift. You raise the tray carefully, keeping it level so that the tiles do not slide, and you walk with slow, measured steps out of the shed and into the yard. The outside air is cooler than the air in the shed, and it brushes against your face and arms with a fresh, damp coolness that is not unpleasant. The yard is still wet from the rain, and your sandals sink slightly into the softened earth, leaving shallow prints that fill slowly with water. You cross the yard at a slow pace, watching the ground ahead for any stones or ruts that might trip you, and you pass the kiln with its quiet, smoky breath, and the water barrel with its brimming, silvery surface. The magpie is gone now, and the yard is empty, silent except for the distant trickle of the brook and the occasional soft call of a wood pigeon from the alder trees. The drying shed stands on the far side of the yard, a long, open-sided structure built of timber posts and a slatted roof that lets the air circulate freely while keeping the direct rain off the tiles. Its floor is simply the bare earth, beaten flat and swept clean, and within it rows of wooden racks stretch away into the dimness, their shelves rising one above the other like the bunks of a ship. Each shelf is a flat plank supported by pegs, and most of the shelves already hold tiles in varying stages of dryness, from the dark grey of the freshly made to the pale, chalky grey of those that have been drying for a week or more. You step into the drying shed and pause to let your eyes adjust to the deeper shade. The air here is cooler still, and it smells of earth and drying clay and the faint, mushroomy scent of old wood that has been damp for many seasons. The shelves are organized by the day of production, and you walk along the rows until you find the shelf that holds the tiles you made yesterday, the ones that are now a day into their drying. You check them briefly, running a fingertip over the nearest tile to feel how it has firmed, and you note with satisfaction that the surface is no longer tacky, but has developed a dry, leathery skin that resists gentle pressure. Beside yesterday's shelf is an empty shelf, the one you will fill with today's tiles. The shelf is long enough to hold a full batch of 12, and its surface has been brushed clean and lightly dusted with powder. You lower the tray carefully, resting one edge on the shelf support, and you transfer the tiles one by one, lifting each from the tray and sliding it gently onto the plank. The tiles move easily, their powdered underside slipping over the wood without resistance, and you align them as you align them on the tray, in a straight row with even gaps between, a neat line of grey rectangles that stretches from one end of the shelf to the other. When all 12 tiles are in place, you step back and check the alignment, nudging one tile slightly to the left and another slightly forward until the row is perfectly uniform. The sight of the tiles on the shelf, the newest additions to the slow, silent process of drying, fills you with a quiet contentment that is as much a part of the work as the clay itself. You know that these tiles will sit here for days, slowly losing their moisture to the cool, circulating air, and you know that you will return each morning to turn them and check for cracks and move the driest ones to the stack for the kiln. But that work is for later, and for now you simply stand in the dim, quiet shed, surrounded by the scent of drying clay and the faint, far-off sound of the brook, and you let the stillness settle over you. You pick up the empty tray and carry it back out into the yard, where the grey sky still hangs low and featureless, and you walk slowly across the wet earth to the main shed. Your body feels the pleasant tiredness of work completed, a heaviness in your arms and legs that is not exhaustion, but the satisfaction of having moved and lifted and carried. Inside the shed, you lean the tray against the wall beside the door and look at the bench where the 12 empty molds now sit, their sandy interiors bare and ready for tomorrow's pressing. You will clean them later, tapping out the used powder and rubbing the wood with a dry cloth. But for now, they can wait. You walk to the doorway and stand looking out at the tilery, your hands resting on the rough timber frame, your eyes moving slowly across the familiar shapes of the kiln and the pits and the drying shed and the alder trees beyond. The smoke still rises in its steady column, and the water still drips from the thatch, and the day continues to pass with the same slow, unhurried pace that it has followed since you first stepped onto the field path this morning. The tiles are on their shelf, the molds are empty, and the quiet rhythm of the tilery has brought you once again to a small, peaceful pause in the endless cycle of the work. You leave the main shed and cross the yard again, your sandals finding the now familiar wet give of the softened earth, your breath a slow and steady rhythm that matches the pace of your walking. The grey sky above has not changed in hours, or if it has changed, the difference is too subtle for your eyes to detect. A seamless blanket of cloud that diffuses the light evenly across the tilery and the fields and the distant line of alder trees. The air is cool and still, carrying the clean, washed scent of the recent rain mixed with the fainter, drier smell of wood smoke from the kiln. And as you walk, you feel the slight breeze that has risen touch your face and then fall away again, as if the wind itself is too drowsy to sustain its own motion. The drying shed stands before you, its open sides dark and quiet under the slatted roof, and you step across the threshold from the soft grey daylight into the deeper, cooler shadow within. Your eyes adjust slowly, the shapes of the racks and shelves emerging from the dimness like familiar furniture in a room you have lived in all your life, and you pause for a moment just inside the entrance, letting the quiet of the shed settle around you. The air here is different from the air outside, cooler by several degrees and noticeably drier, because the drying shed is built to draw moisture away from the tiles, and the constant slow circulation of air through the open sides carries the dampness out into the fields where it mingles with the mist and the clouds and the general wetness of the world. You walk deeper into the shed, your footsteps soft on the beaten earth floor, and you come to the shelf where yesterday's tiles rest in their neat row. These are the tiles you pressed and trimmed and carried here on the previous morning, and they have now had a full day and a night of drying in the quiet, shadowed air. You reach out and touch the nearest tile with the tips of your fingers, and you feel at once that the clay has changed. It is no longer soft and yielding, no longer sticky or cool in the way of fresh, wet clay, but has developed a firm, leathery skin that resists gentle pressure without cracking. The surface is still cool to the touch, but it is a different kind of coolness now, the coolness of damp stone rather than wet mud, and when you press a little harder with your thumb, The clay gives only slightly and then holds its shape. You lift the tile from the shelf with both hands, cradling it as you have cradled hundreds of tiles before, and you turn it over to inspect the underside. The stamped letters of the workshop mark are still clear and sharp, but the edges of the impression have softened almost imperceptibly, the crisp lines blurring into the gentler contours that come as the clay begins to lose its moisture. The terracotta powder that dusted the shelf has clung to the underside in a faint, patchy bloom, and you brush it away with a light sweep of your palm, feeling the dry, silky texture of the powder against your skin. The tile is sound without cracks or warping, and you set it back on the shelf with the same careful motion, face up this time, the smooth, paddle-finished surface now exposed to the circulating air. Now you turn to the shelf that holds the tiles from 2 days ago, the ones that are further along in their drying. These tiles have a paler color than yesterday's, the dark gray having faded to a lighter, chalkier shade, and when you touch them the surface feels dry and firm, with no trace of the cool dampness that clings to the newer tiles. The clay has begun to ring slightly when you tap it with your knuckle, a faint, hollow sound that is still muted but carries the promise of the hard, true ring that will come after the kiln firing. The drying is proceeding evenly, the tiles losing their moisture at a steady, unhurried pace that matches the slow rhythm of the tilery itself. You begin the work of turning these older tiles, a task that is simple and repetitive and requires no thought at all. One by one, you lift each tile from the shelf, turn it over so that the underside faces upward, and replace it in its spot with the same careful alignment. The turning is necessary because the tiles dry unevenly if left in one position, the bottom face remaining damp while the top face hardens, and the tension that builds between the two surfaces can cause warping or cracking. By turning them each day, you ensure that both sides are exposed equally to the air, that the moisture leaves the clay in a slow, balanced migration from the center outward, that the tile remains flat and true through every stage of the drying. Your hands move through the turning with the same automatic grace that they bring to the pressing and the trimming, lifting and turning and replacing, lifting and turning and replacing. A slow procession along the shelf that takes you from one end to the other. The tiles click softly against the wood as you set them down, a quiet, rhythmic sound that echoes faintly in the dim shed and then fades. As you work, your mind drifts into a calm, empty state, not asleep, but not fully awake either, suspended in a quiet place between awareness and dreaming, where there is nothing but the feel of the clay and the sound of the tiles and the cool, dry air of the shed. When you have turned all the older tiles, you move on to the shelf that holds the tiles from 3 days ago, the ones that are now nearly dry. These tiles are pale and firm. The surface is a uniform light grey that is almost white in the dim light, and they feel warm to the touch now, having lost the last of their cool dampness. You lift each one and turn it, the motion as familiar as breathing, and you run your fingertip along the edges to check for any fine cracks that might have developed. The clay is smooth and sound, without flaws, and you set each tile back with a quiet sense of satisfaction that you do not need to acknowledge in words. A robin perches on a rafter above your head, the same robin perhaps that sheltered under the kiln eaves during the rain, or another robin entirely, there is no way to tell. It watches you with one bright black eye, its head cocked slightly to one side, and it makes no sound at all, no song, no call, just the silent, attentive presence of a small wild thing that has grown accustomed to your daily movements. You glance up at it briefly, registering its red breast and its neat brown wings and the way its claws grip the rough timber, and then you return your gaze to the tiles, and the robin remains where it is, a quiet companion in the shadowed shed. The oldest tiles on the shelf are now ready to be moved. These are the tiles you pressed 5 days ago, and they have dried to a hard, chalky state that is still fragile but stable enough to handle. Their color is a pale, dusty grey, almost white, and when you tap them, they ring with a clear, dry note that tells you they are ready for the kiln. You lift them one by one and carry them to a separate stack that waits at the end of the drying shed. A stack of tiles that have finished their drying and are now waiting for the loading day. The stack is built carefully, each tile laid flat on top of the one below, with a thin spacer of twig or straw between to prevent sticking, and you add the new tiles to the top of the pile with the same careful alignment, building the stack higher by small, steady increments. The air in the drying shed is a slow, patient thing, moving almost imperceptibly through the open sides, carrying the moisture from the fresh tiles out into the fields and bringing in the drier air from outside. You can feel it on your skin as a faint coolness, a gentle current that is barely strong enough to stir the fine hairs on your arms, and you can smell it in the scent of the shed, the earthy, mushroomy scent of old wood and drying clay, and the faint, clean sharpness of the terracotta powder. The robin shifts on its rafter, ruffling its feathers and settling again, and the only sound is the soft whisper of your own movements and the distant, steady breath of the kiln. You walk back to the shelf that holds the tiles you placed here earlier today, the newest batch, still wet and dark and glistening. You check them in the same way you checked yesterday's tiles, running your fingertips over the surfaces to feel how they have begun to change in the short time since you carried them from the main shed. The surfaces are still tacky, still slightly sticky to the touch, but a thin skin has already begun to form on the exposed faces, a delicate, almost invisible membrane that is the first sign of the long drying process. The tiles are exactly as they should be, and you leave them as they are, face up on their shelf, knowing that you will return tomorrow to turn them and check them and move them one step further along their slow journey. You step back from the shelves and stand in the center of the drying shed, your hands resting at your sides, your eyes moving slowly across the rows of tiles that fill the racks. There are tiles here from many days of work, tiles in every stage of drying, from the dark, glossy wetness of this morning's batch to the pale, chalky dryness of the tiles that will soon be loaded into the kiln. The site is a quiet record of the passing days, a visual calendar written in clay and moisture, and the slow, patient work of your hands. And you feel a sense of connection to it that is deeper than pride and simpler than ownership, a sense of belonging to a process that began long before you and will continue long after. The robin on the rafter shifts again and then, with a soft flutter of wings, flies out through the open side of the shed into the grey afternoon light. You watch it go, a small brown shape that darts across the yard and disappears into the alder trees, and then you turn back to the shelves and begin a final inspection of the drying tiles, moving slowly along the rows and checking each shelf in turn. Your eyes pass over the surfaces, looking for any sign of cracking or warping, any thin spots or hollows that might weaken the tiles in the firing. The clay is sound, every tile flat and smooth and true, and you finish the inspection with the same quiet satisfaction that has accompanied every stage of the work today. The light in the drying shed has grown dimmer while you worked, the grey sky outside deepening toward a softer, darker shade that suggests the afternoon is wearing on toward evening. You cannot see the sun, of course, because the sun has been hidden behind the clouds all day, but the quality of the light has changed in a way that you have learned to read, a subtle shift from the pale, even grey of midday to the heavier, more layered grey of the approaching dusk. The shadows under the shelves have deepened, and the racks themselves seem to recede into the darkness, the rows of tiles fading into a soft, indistinct blur. You walk to the entrance of the drying shed and stand looking out at the tilery, your hands resting on the rough timber of a support post. The yard is empty and still, the puddles from the morning rain now shrunk to dark, wet patches on the beaten earth, the kiln chimney sending up its unbroken column of smoke that still rises, straight before bending slightly to the east. The main shed is a low, dark shape across the yard, its thatch roof glistening faintly with the last of the rain, and beyond it, the clay pits are quiet hollows filled with shadow. The world is peaceful and still, wrapped in the same slow, grey quiet that has held it all day, and you feel a deep, wordless contentment settle over you like a blanket. You turn back into the drying shed for one last look at the tiles, walking slowly past the shelves and checking that everything is in order, that the tiles are properly aligned, that the stacks are stable, that no small animal has disturbed the arrangements. Everything is as it should be, and you nod once to yourself in the dimness, a small private gesture of completion that no one sees and no one needs to see. The work of the day is nearly done now, the pressing and the trimming and the carrying and the turning all completed in their slow, methodical order, and what remains is only the quiet closing of the shed and the walk back across the wet grass to the huts. You leave the drying shed and step out into the yard, where the air is cooler now and carries the first faint hint of the evening mist that will rise from the brook after dark. The magpie has returned to its perch on the kiln eaves, and it watches you with the same bright, curious eye as you walk past, making no sound, offering no movement except the slight cocking of its head. You walk to the main shed and pause at the door, looking inside at the bench where the empty molds still sit in their tidy row, the paddle resting on its shelf, the trough of clay covered by its damp cloth. Everything is ready for tomorrow, and you close the door of the shed gently, pulling the wooden latch into place with a soft, familiar click. The path back to the hut stretches before you, pale and winding, already beginning to blur at the edges as the evening mist seeps up from the damp ground. You step through the gate and begin to walk, your pace as slow and steady as it was this morning, your sandals making the same soft, wet sounds on the grass and the crushed chalk. The older trees are dark shapes against the darker sky, and the brook gurgles somewhere in the hollow, a sound that is louder now in the stillness of the evening. The crow calls once from far away, and the call hangs in the damp air for a moment before fading, leaving only the sound of your footsteps and the quiet rhythm of your breath. You walk on, following the familiar track that you have walked so many times before, and the mist rises around you slowly, curling up from the ditches and the hollows, softening the edges of the world until everything is grey and quiet and still. The day has been long and slow and full of small, careful tasks, and your body carries the pleasant heaviness of work completed. By the time you reach the cluster of huts, the light will be almost gone, and you will push open the low door and step inside to the warmth of the hearth, leaving the tilery to rest under the grey evening sky, its smoke still rising, its tiles still drying, its quiet rhythm waiting for the morning when you will return and begin again. You wake on loading day to a morning that feels different from the other mornings, though the sky is the same soft grey, and the mist lies in the same hollows, and the path beneath your sandals is the same pale ribbon of packed chalk and crushed earth. The difference is not in the weather or the light or the sounds of the waking valley, but in the shape of the work ahead, the knowledge that today the dried tiles will move from the shadow of the drying shed into the round brick chamber of the kiln, where fire and clay will meet and the long transformation will begin. You walk the familiar track with the same slow, steady pace, but there is a quiet alertness in you, a sense of purpose that is not urgency but readiness, the calm anticipation of a task that requires care and patience and many hands. The tilery appears out of the mist as it always does, first the chimney, and then the thatch, and then the low sprawl of the sheds and the pits. But today there is already smoke rising from the kiln chimney, a slightly thicker column than usual, because the kiln has been warmed gently through the night to drive out any last moisture from the brickwork. You push open the gate and step into the yard, and you see that the other worker has already arrived, a figure you have worked beside so many times that his presence is as familiar and unremarkable as the water barrel or the bench. He stands by the wood pile, sorting through the split lengths of beechwood and stacking the thinner sticks into bundles for the early stages of the firing, and he raises a hand in a brief silent greeting that you return with the same small gesture before you walk to the main shed to collect your paddle and your rag. The morning is cool and still, the kind of morning that holds its breath, and the sounds of the tilery are muted and calm. You fill a dipper of water from the barrel and drink slowly, feeling the cold spread down through your chest, and then you walk across the yard to the drying shed where the ready stack waits. The ready stack has grown over the past days, tile by tile, until it now holds several dozen tiles that are fully dry, pale and chalky, and light in the hand. Their surface is a uniform grey-white that is almost the colour of the overcast sky. You stand beside the stack for a moment, looking at the tiles and thinking about the order in which you will carry them, the path you will take across the yard, the careful arrangement that must be built inside the kiln. The other worker finishes at the woodpile and walks over to join you, his sandals making the same soft, wet sounds on the beaten earth. He carries a pair of leather gloves tucked into his belt, and he nods toward the ready stack with a slight tilt of his head that asks without words whether you are ready to begin. You nod back, and the two of you move to the stack and begin the slow, methodical work of loading the kiln. The kiln stands at the edge of the yard, a circular structure built of thick brick and clay mortar, its walls blackened on the inside from many firings and its arched roof rising to a narrow chimney that breathes the smoke up into the grey sky. The entrance is a low, arched opening just wide enough for a man to stoop through, and inside the chamber is a circular space with a floor of fired brick that has been swept clean since the last unloading. The walls curve upward to the arched ceiling, and the whole interior is dark and cool, smelling of old ash and baked clay, and the faint sharp tang of the wood smoke that has been rising through it since the night before. A small spy hole is set into the wall at eye level, and a larger opening at the base leads to the firebox where the wood will be fed. You stoop and step inside the kiln, feeling the temperature change as you pass from the cool morning air into the warmer interior, and you stand upright in the circular chamber, your head just clearing the curve of the arched ceiling. The space is empty and waiting, and you turn slowly, looking at the walls and the floor and the spy hole, mentally mapping the arrangement of the tiles, the layers and the gaps and the channels that must be left for the hot air to circulate. The loading of the kiln is a careful, deliberate task that requires attention and patience, because the tiles must be stacked in a way that allows the heat to reach every surface evenly, so that each tile fires to the same hardness and the same warm orange-red color. You step back out into the yard and walk to the ready stack, and you pick up the first tile with both hands. The tile is dry and light, much lighter than the wet tiles you handle every day, and its surface is smooth and cool and faintly dusty to the touch. The stamped letters of the workshop mark are crisp and clear on the underside, and you check them briefly before you carry the tile to the kiln and pass it through the low entrance to the other worker, who has already taken his place inside the chamber. He receives the tile with both hands and sets it down carefully on the brick floor, positioning it upright on its long edge against the curved wall, where it will form the first tile of the first ring. You return to the stack for the second tile, and the work settles into its rhythm, a steady, unhurried chain of passing and receiving that moves the tiles one by one from the drying shed to the kiln. You walk back and forth across the yard, your footsteps slow and measured, your arms cradling each tile with the same care you would give to something precious, and the other worker takes each tile from you and places it in its position inside the chamber, building up the arrangement from the floor toward the ceiling. The tiles click softly as they meet one another, a quiet, rhythmic sound that echoes inside the kiln and falls on your ears as a kind of music, a slow, deliberate percussion that marks the progress of the loading. The arrangement of the tiles inside the kiln follows a pattern that has been used for as long as the tilery has stood. The tiles are stood on their long edges, not laid flat, so that the hot air can rise between them and circulate freely. They are placed in concentric rings that follow the curve of the circular walls, each ring slightly smaller than the one below, building upward in steady, even layers. Between each tile, small play spaces are inserted, little wedges or pellets of fired clay that hold the tiles apart just enough for the heat to pass through, preventing them from touching and fusing together during the firing. The spacers are kept in a basket beside the kiln door, and the other worker dips into the basket as he works, placing a spacer between each new tile with a precise, automatic motion. You continue to ferry the tiles from the stack to the kiln, and as you walk back and forth across the yard, you notice that the morning mist has finally lifted, leaving the grass wet and glistening and the alder trees sharp against the pale grey sky. The robin is back on its rafter in the drying shed, and it watches you pass with the same silent, attentive gaze, its red breast a small bright spot in the dimness. The magpie has moved from the kiln eaves to the fence post by the gate, and it too watches the work, its head cocked to one side, its black and white feathers sleek against the damp air. The tilery is a quiet, busy place, the two of you moving in your slow, coordinated rhythm, while the birds look on and the smoke rises and the world continues its grey, unhurried turning. When you have carried all the tiles from the ready stack, you pause to wipe your forehead with the back of your hand, feeling the slight warmth that the work has raised in you despite the coolness of the day. The other worker climbs out of the kiln and stands beside you, brushing the dust from his tunic, and the two of you look at the stack that remains, the tiles that are not yet fully dry and will wait for the next loading day. The ready stack is empty now, and the tiles that took you so many days to press and trim and turn and dry have all been carried into the dark waiting chamber of the kiln. You step inside the kiln to inspect the arrangement, stooping through the low entrance and standing upright in the warm, dim interior. The tiles rise around you in neat, orderly layers, their pale grey surfaces catching the faint light that comes through the spy hole and the entrance, and the spacers hold them apart in even, regular gaps that form a delicate lattice of clay and air. You walk slowly around the circular floor, checking the alignment of the rings, making sure that the gaps are consistent, that no tile is leaning or unstable, that the channels for the hot air are open and clear, the arrangement is sound, and you nod to yourself in the dimness, a small private confirmation that the loading has been done properly. You climb back out into the yard, and the other worker has already begun to prepare the clay plaster that will seal the kiln door. He works at the bench in the main shed, mixing dry clay powder with water in a shallow trough, kneading it with his hands until it forms a smooth, sticky paste that will harden into a solid seal when the kiln heats up. You join him at the bench and take a share of the plaster, scooping it up in your palms and carrying it to the kiln entrance, where you begin to pack it into the gaps around the doorway. The sealing of the kiln is a slow, careful task because the door must be completely airtight to control the flow of oxygen to the fire. You press the wet clay plaster into the cracks and joints around the wooden frame of the door, smoothing it with your thumbs and building up layers until the entrance is sealed except for a small square spy hole that is left open at eye level. The plaster is cool and sticky on your hands, and it smells of the same clean, earthy scent as the clay you press into the molds every day, and working with it feels familiar and comfortable. A return to the material that is at the center of everything you do. When the door is sealed, you and the other workers step back and look at the kiln. The round brick structure with its plastered entrance and its narrow chimney and its spy hole glinting darkly in the grey light. The kiln is ready now, loaded and sealed, and the next stage of the work will be the lighting of the fire. The other worker walks to the wood pile and begins to carry armloads of the split beechwood to the area beside the firebox, stacking the thin sticks and the thicker logs in separate piles that will be easy to reach during the long hours of the firing. You follow him and help with the carrying, and soon there is a substantial pile of wood beside the kiln, enough to feed the fire through the day and into the night. You pause for a moment beside the firebox, your hands resting on the warm brick, and you look through the small opening into the dark interior where the fire will soon be lit. The firebox is a simple chamber, a brick-lined pit beneath the main kiln chamber, with a grate of iron bars to hold the wood and a channel that carries the heat upward into the space where the tiles are stacked. The ash from the last firing has been cleaned out, and the grate is bare and ready, waiting for the first handful of kindling. You feel a quiet sense of anticipation, not excitement exactly, but a calm, steady readiness, the knowledge that the long, slow process of the firing is about to begin. The other worker brings a clay pot of embers from the small hearth in the main shed, carrying it carefully across the yard with both hands wrapped in leather gloves. The embers blow a deep, dull red inside the pot, and a thin wisp of smoke rises from them and trails away on the faint breeze. He sets the pot down beside the firebox and looks at you, and you nod, and he tips the embers onto the grate and adds a handful of dry straw and a few of the thinnest sticks of beechwood, arranging them with a careful, practiced hand. The straw catches almost at once, a small, bright flame that curls upward and licks at the sticks, and the fire begins its slow, steady birth in the darkness of the firebox. You add more sticks, feeding them through the opening one by one, placing them carefully so that the flames can climb and spread without smothering themselves. The wood crackles and pops, small sharp sounds that echo inside the brick chamber, and the firelight flickers against the walls, painting the dark interior with shifting patterns of orange and gold. The smoke thickens for a moment and then thins as the fire finds its rhythm and it rises up through the channel and into the kiln chamber, beginning the long, gentle process of driving out the last traces of moisture from the dried tiles. The temperature inside the kiln will rise slowly over many hours because the tiles cannot be heated too quickly or they will crack from the thermal shock. The fire you build now is a small, gentle fire, barely more than a bed of glowing embers and licking flames, enough to warm the chamber and chase the dampness from the tiles and the walls and the clay plaster of the door. The fiercer heat will come later, after dark, when the tiles have been slowly warmed and the moisture has been driven off, and the clay is ready to receive the full intensity of the firing. But that is hours away, and for now there is only the small, steady fire, and the quiet task of feeding it with thin sticks and watching the flames curl and dance in the darkness. You settle onto an upturned log beside the firebox, your back resting against the warm brick of the kiln wall, and you watch the fire through the opening while the other worker returns to the woodpile to split more kindling. The flames are hypnotic, shifting and reforming constantly, their colors running from pale yellow at the tips to a deep, rich orange at the heart, and they make a soft, rushing sound, a kind of whispered roar that is both constant and always changing. The warmth from the firebox seeps into your legs and your chest, and you feel the contrast between that warmth and the cool, damp air at your back, the two temperatures meeting around your shoulders in a pleasant, balanced sensation that is neither hot nor cold. The robin has left the drying shed and now perches on the edge of the water barrel, dipping its beak into the silvery surface and then tilting its head back to swallow. The magpie has flown away into the alder trees, and the yard is quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of the other worker splitting wood with a small hatchet, a rhythmic thunk and split that echoes across the damp grass and fades into the grey sky. The smoke from the chimney has thickened slightly now, a fuller, darker column that rises with more purpose than before, and it carries with it the scent of burning beechwood, a sweet, clean smell that blends with the earthy scent of the kiln and the damp scent of the morning. You feed the fire for a long stretch of time, adding a few sticks every so often, watching them catch and blaze and then settle into glowing embers that pulse with a deep internal light. Your mind drifts into the same calm, empty state that comes during any repetitive work, and you find yourself thinking about nothing at all, simply watching the flames and feeling the warmth and listening to the crackle and the pop and the soft, steady breathing of the kiln. The morning passes around you without any marker except the slow consumption of the woodpile and the gradual, almost imperceptible increase in the temperature of the brick at your back. The other worker returns from the woodpile and sits down on another upturned log on the opposite side of the firebox, and the two of you sit in companionable silence, taking turns to feed the fire, watching the flames and the smoke and the slow, steady rise of the grey column into the grey sky. The day continues, unhurried and peaceful, the kiln breathing its warm breath into the cool air, the tiles sitting in their careful rings inside the dark chamber, and the two of you waiting with the patience of those who know that fire and clay move at their own pace and cannot be rushed. The kiln stands waiting in the grey light of the loading day, its round brick body solid and dark against the paler sky, its narrow chimney pointing upward like a single finger raised to test the wind. You approach it with the quiet familiarity of someone who has walked this path many times, your arms full of dried tiles that you have lifted from the stack at the back of the drying shed, the stack that has been growing day by day as each batch completed its slow curing. The tiles are light now, their moisture gone, their color a pale, chalky gray that is almost white, and they clink softly against one another as you carry them, a dry, hollow sound that is entirely unlike the wet slap of fresh clay. The kiln is a circular structure built of thick brick and fired clay, its walls blackened on the inside by many firings and weathered on the outside to a mottled brown-grey. It stands a little apart from the other buildings, as if it knows that it contains a fiercer heat than anything else in the tilery, and its presence is both comforting and slightly solemn. The firebox mouth opens at the base like a low, dark arch, and the spy hole above it is a smaller opening, barely the size of your fist, through which you will later watch the glow of the flames. Today the kiln is cold and silent, its interior swept clean of old ash, its floor laid with a thin bed of sand to support the tiles during the firing. Another worker is already there when you arrive, a person you have worked beside for so many seasons that words are rarely needed between you. You greet each other with a small nod, and then you begin the slow, methodical work of loading. The loading is a careful process because the tiles must be arranged inside the kiln in a way that allows the heat to reach every surface evenly, without cold spots or hot spots that might cause cracking. You pass the first tile hand to hand, and the other worker takes it and walks into the kiln, where they set it on edge against the curved wall, leaning it slightly so that it stands with a narrow gap between itself and the brick. Another tile follows, and another, and the two of you settle into a rhythm that is as steady as the pressing had been, a slow chain of passing and placing, passing and placing. You stand outside the kiln and hand the tiles in one by one, choosing each from the stack with care, always the driest and soundest first. The tiles pass from your hands to the other worker's hands with a soft, dry click, and then you hear the faint scraping sound as each one is positioned on the sand floor and nudged into alignment. The kiln fills slowly from the outside in, the first ring of tiles standing along the curved wall, then a second ring inside that, separated by small clay spaces that keep the tiles from touching, and then a third ring, each layer tighter than the one before, until the floor of the kiln is a dense, concentric pattern of pale grey rectangles, all standing on edge like books on a shelf. When the first layer is complete, you carry in a supply of flat clay plates that serve as shelves, laying them across the tops of the standing tiles to create a platform for the next layer. These shelves are made of the same clay as the tiles, fired once before to make them strong, and they fit together with small gaps that allow the heat to rise through. The other worker passes them up to you now, standing inside the kiln, while you lift the plates from the stack outside, and the two of you build the platform slowly, checking that it is level and stable before you begin loading the second layer of tiles. The second layer rises in the same way, tiles standing on edge in concentric rings, spaces between them, the pattern repeating exactly as it did below. The air inside the kiln is cool and still, smelling of old ash and dry clay, and the only sounds of a soft scrape of the tiles against the sand and the occasional quiet word exchange between you and your companion. The light inside is dim, coming only from the open doorway and the spy hole, and your eyes adapt to the shadows as you work so that you can see the pale shapes of the tiles and the darker outlines of the brick walls and the small, careful movements of the other workers' hands. By the time the third layer is loaded, the kiln is more than half full, and you must reach higher to pass the tiles, stretching your arms upward while the other worker stands on a low wooden block to receive them. The motion is a little slower now because the height requires more care, and you pause between each tile to ensure that your grip is secure and the pass is clean. The rhythm continues, unhurried and steady, and the kiln fills by degrees, the rings of tiles climbing toward the arched ceiling until there is only a small space left at the very top, just below the curve of the dome. The last tiles are the trickiest to place because the curve of the ceiling leaves little room to maneuver, and you must pass each one carefully through the narrowing gap while the other worker guides it into position with outstretched fingers. These final tiles are smaller ones, cut to fit the odd spaces, and they slot into place with a satisfying snugness, completing the tight-packed mosaic of the upper layer. When the last tile is in position, the other worker climbs down from the wooden block and steps out of the kiln, and the two of you stand side by side for a moment, looking into the dark, full interior where hundreds of pale tiles stand waiting in their careful arrangement. Now comes the ceiling. You mix a bucket of wet clay with a little sand and chopped straw, working it with your hands until it forms a stiff, sticky paste, and you carry it to the kiln doorway. The door itself is a flat slab of fired clay that fits into the opening, but it cannot simply be set in place because the heat of the firing would escape through the cracks. You press the wet clay mixture into the gaps around the door slab, smoothing it with your palms, filling every seam and joint until the doorway is sealed tight. The clay plaster is cool and gritty under your hands, and you work it into the crevices with the same patient attention you give to every part of the tile-making process, ensuring that no gap remains. At the top of the sealed door, you leave a small spy hole open, a hole no larger than a walnut through which you will watch the fire and check the color of the tiles inside. The other worker hands you a small clay plug that can be inserted into the hole when you do not need to look, and you set it on a ledge beside the kiln where it will be easy to reach. Then you wipe your hands on your rag and step back, surveying the sealed kiln with the same quiet satisfaction that follows every completed stage of the work. The other worker gathers up the empty buckets and the spare spaces and carries them back toward the main shed, their figure growing smaller as they cross the yard. And you are left alone with the kiln. The day has moved into its later hours while you load it, the grey sky taking on the faintly heavier quality that means evening is not far off, and the air is cooling slowly, the dampness of the ground beginning to rise as the warmth of the day fades. You kneel beside the kiln and begin to arrange the first armload of wood in the firebox, the fuel that will burn through the night and through the next day, and perhaps into the night after that. The wood is split beech, cut from the coppice beyond the brook, and seasoned for a full year until it is pale and dry and light in the hand. You lay the thinnest sticks in first, building a small loose teepee over a twist of dried grass that will catch the first spark, and then you add slightly thicker sticks around it, and then a few split logs, arranging everything so that the air can flow freely through the gaps and feed the flames when they come. The firebox is blackened with old soot, and still smells faintly of the last firing, a smell like cold ashes and burnt earth, and you breathe it in without thought, as familiar as the scent of the clay pits. When the wood is arranged to your satisfaction, you take the fire starter from its niche beside the kiln, a small clay pot containing a smouldering piece of charcoal from the hearth in the main shed that you wrapped in dried moss earlier in the day. You blow gently on the charcoal until it glows orange, and then you touch it to the twist of dried grass in the firebox. The grass catches at once, a tiny flame that curls upward, yellow and thin, and then it spreads to the smallest sticks, and the fire begins to whisper. The sound is a soft, rustling crackle, as gentle as the rain on the thatch had been, and you watch the flame grow from a single thread into a small, busy fire that licks at the beechwood and sends a trickle of pale smoke up into the kiln flue. The smoke rises through the chamber, weaving between the standing tiles and the clay shelves, and then it emerges from the chimney in a thicker, whiter plume than before, a signal to anyone watching that the firing has begun. You sit back on your heels for a moment, watching the fire establish itself, feeling the faint warmth that already begins to radiate from the firebox mouth. The warmth is small now, just a gentle heat against your face, but you know it will grow as the night deepens. You add a few more sticks, beating the fire in small amounts, never too much at once, because the early stage of the firing must be slow and gentle to drive out the last traces of moisture from the tiles without cracking them. If the heat rises too quickly, the trapped water will turn to steam and burst the clay, and weeks of work will be lost in a moment. So you are patient, and you feed the fire with the same calm, methodical rhythm that you bring to every part of your trade. The evening settles around you as the fire grows, the grey sky darkening from pale slate to deep charcoal, and the shapes of the buildings begin to soften and blur. The other worker has gone to the huts now, and you are alone in the tilery with the kiln and the fire and the slow, steady passage of the night. You have sat through many night firings before, and you know the way the hours will stretch and fold, the way the darkness will feel at first like a long expanse of time, and then, gradually, like a familiar companion. You pull up the low wooden stool that always stands beside the kiln, and you settle yourself on it with your back against the warm bricks, your legs stretched out before you, your hands resting on your knees. For the first hour, the work is simple and rhythmic. You watch the flames through the firebox mouth, judging their color and their strength, and you add wood whenever the fire begins to thin, feeding it with small sticks that you break over your knee, then larger ones, then the first of the split logs. Each piece of wood you place catches quickly and burns with a bright, eager flame, and the heat inside the kiln begins to build. A slow, invisible accumulation that you can sense more through the changing sound of the fire than through any outward sign. The fire hisses and pops, the wood snaps as the sap boils out of it, and the chimney above you draws the smoke upward with a low, steady roar that is not loud but constant, a deep breath that never falters. You rise from the stool now and then to fetch more wood from the stack beside the drying shed, carrying armloads back to the kiln and stacking them neatly beside the firebox where they will be easy to reach in the dark hours ahead. The stack is large, enough to last through the night and into the next day, and you have built it yourself over the past week, splitting the beech logs with a long-handled axe and piling them under a lean-to shelter to keep off the rain. The wood is smooth and pale, and it smells clean and dry, a smell that mingles with the smoke and the earth and the faint, distant scent of the alder trees. As the night deepens, the world around the kiln shrinks to a small circle of firelight. Beyond the circle, the yard and the sheds and the clay pits are lost in utter blackness, a darkness so complete that you cannot see your own hand if you hold it away from the fire. The only things that exist are the flames, the warm bricks, the stack of wood, and the quiet, steady rhythm of your own breathing. The firelight dances on your face and arms, painting your skin in shades of orange and gold, and you feel the warmth of it sinking into your bones, a deep, penetrating heat that is welcome after the damp chill of the damps. The spy hole in the kiln door glows faintly as the hours pass, a small orange eye that brightens by degrees. You rise and walk to it from time to time, pulling out the clay plug and peering inside to check the color of the tiles. At first the interior is dark, lit only by the flicker of the flames from below, and the tiles are pale shapes in the gloom. But as the heat builds, the tiles begin to glow, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. A faint red blush that creeps across their surfaces like dawn spreading across a field. You watch the color deepen from red to orange, and you know that the firing is progressing as it should, the heat penetrating evenly through the packed chamber, driving the last of the chemically bound water from the clay, transforming the soft, chalky tiles into hard, ringing terracotta. You return to the stool and sit again, your back against the warm bricks, and you listen to the sounds of the night. The fire roars softly, the wood crackles and pops, and somewhere far away an owl calls once, a low, hollow hoot that carries across the fields and fades into the darkness. The brook is a distant murmur, barely audible beneath the sound of the kiln, and the wind has dropped entirely, leaving the air perfectly still. The stars are hidden behind the cloud cover, but now and then a gap opens in the clouds and a single star appears, a tiny point of cold white light that seems impossibly far away, and you watch it for a while before the clouds close over it again, and it vanishes as if it had never been. The hours pass in a strange, suspended way, time moving differently in the darkness beside the kiln than it does in the ordinary daylight world. You do not count the hours, because counting them would serve no purpose, and you have no way to measure them anyway, except by the slow consumption of the wood pile and the steady deepening of the glow in the spy hole. You add wood. You watch the flames. You probe the interior with your eyes through the small orange hole, and then you sit again, and the cycle repeats, over and over, a quiet, steady rhythm that lulls your mind into a state of calm, alert stillness. In the deepest part of the night, when the darkness is at its thickest, and even the owl has fallen silent, you feed the fire with larger logs, building the heat toward its peak. The firebox mouth is now a roaring furnace of white-yellow flame, and the heat that pours from it is intense, forcing you to turn your face away when you approach to add more wood. The bricks of the kiln are hot to the touch, and the spy hole glows a brilliant, steady orange. The tiles inside now so bright that you can barely distinguish their individual shapes, seeing only a single, unified blaze of heat and light. This is the critical stage, the point at which the clay vitrifies and becomes hard and waterproof, and you watch it with the same careful, unhurried attention that you have given to every part of the process, knowing that the tiles are transforming in the heat, that the ancient river silt is becoming something new and permanent. The sky begins to lighten almost before you expect it, the blackness softening to a deep grey, then a paler grey, and then the first faint hint at the dawn creeps over the eastern hills. The mist rises from the brook as it does every morning, and the shapes of the alder trees and the sheds and the fence posts emerge slowly from the darkness, reclaiming their familiar forms. The robin appears again on its perch under the kiln eaves, its feathers fluffed against the morning chill, and it watches you with the same bright, silent eye. You add the last of the wood to the firebox, a few final logs that will carry the heat through the remaining hours of the firing, and then you sit back on your stool and let the warmth wash over you as the new day rises. The firing will continue for many hours yet, the heat slowly tapering as the fuel burns down, and you will stay beside the kiln until the fire dies and the bricks begin to cool. But for now, in the quiet grey light of the morning, with the mist curling around the alder trees and the robin keeping its silent watch, you allow yourself a moment of stillness. The tiles are inside the kiln, glowing and hardening, and you have done everything correctly, and the quiet rhythm of the tilery continues, unbroken and unhurried, as steady as the smoke that still rises from the chimney and drifts into the pale morning sky. The kiln has stood cooling for nearly 2 full days now, its round brick body slowly surrendering its stored heat to the damp grey air of the tilery. You have returned each morning to press your palm against the outer wall, feeling the warmth recede by degrees, from the fierce, untouchable heat of the firing, to a gentle, body-like warmth, and finally to a coolness that is only slightly above the temperature of the earth itself. On the first morning after the firing, the bricks had still been hot enough to make you pull your hand back. On the second morning, they had been merely warm, like a stone that has lain in the sun. And now, on this third morning, they are cool to the touch, and you know that the kiln is ready to be opened. You walk across the yard through the pale early light. the grass still wet with dew and the mist lying in thin ribbons along the hollows by the brook, and you carry with you a small iron hammer and a bucket for the broken pieces that you may find. The other worker is already there, standing beside the kiln with a wooden mallet in hand, and you greet each other with the same brief nod that has marked the beginning of every working day for as long as you can remember. The air is still and quiet, and the robin is on its usual perch under the eaves of the drying shed, watching with the same bright, incurious eye. You take the iron hammer and begin the careful work of breaking the clay plaster seal around the kiln door. The plaster has baked hard during the firing, transforming from the soft, sticky paste you pressed into the cracks into a brittle grey-white crust that flakes and shatters under the gentle tapping of your hammer. You work slowly, chipping away at the edges in small, controlled strokes, because you do not want to send a crack through the fired door slab that rests behind the plaster. The chips fall away and scatter on the ground at your feet, pale fragments that crunch under your sandals as you shift your weight, and the sound of the hammer is a series of light, ringing taps that echo softly across the yard and then fade. When the plaster has been cleared from the seams, you set the hammer down and grip the edges of the door slab with both hands. The slab is a flat rectangle of fired clay, heavy and dark, and it sits snugly in the arched entrance where you sealed it 2 days ago. You rock it gently from side to side, loosening the last of the plaster grip, and then you lift it away with a careful, steady motion, the weight settling across your shoulders and arms as you carry it aside and lean it against the kiln wall. The open doorway reveals a dark interior, and a breath of warm, dry air wafts out to meet you, carrying the smell of baked clay and wood smoke, and something else, something clean and mineral and almost sweet, the smell of the finished tiles themselves. You stoop and step inside the kiln, your eyes adjusting to the dimness, and the first thing you see is the color. The tiles are no longer the pale chalky grey of the dried, unfired clay, nor the bright glowing orange of the peak firing, but a warm, settled red-orange, the color of terracotta, the color of the earth itself after it has been transformed by fire. The surfaces are matte and slightly dusty from the wood ash that settled during the cooling, and the stamped letters of the workshop mark are sharp and clear on the visible undersides, crisper now than they were at any earlier stage. The heat of the kiln has finished the tiles, turned them from fragile water-soluble slabs into hard, permanent pieces of roofing that will keep the rain out for generations. You reach out and lift the first tile from its place in the ring. It is warm still, a residual warmth that is pleasant against your palms, and it is lighter than the unfired tiles, the clay having lost its chemically bound water and become denser and harder in the process. You tap it with your fingernail, and the tile rings a clear, true note that is nothing like the dull, hollow sound of the dried clay or the wet, silent feel of the fresh pressing. The ringing tells you that the tile is sound, without internal cracks or flaws, and you set it carefully in the bucket you have brought for the finished pieces, placing it on edge so that it will not rest on its sharp corners. The unloading follows a rhythm that is the reverse of the loading, a slow, steady chain of lifting and passing and carrying that moves the tiles one by one from the dark interior of the kiln to the bright grey light of the yard. You work together with the other worker, one of you inside the kiln handing the tiles out through the low doorway, the other outside receiving them and stacking them onto the delivery pallet that has been set up beside the kiln wall. The pallet is a sturdy wooden frame with raised edges, and it will hold the finished tiles in neat, compact layers until they are carried away to the building site where they will be laid on a roof. Inside the kiln, the air is still warm and close, and you feel the faint heat of the bricks radiating against your face and arms as you work. The tiles are arranged in their careful rings, just as you left them, and you begin with the topmost layer, lifting each tile gently, checking it with a tap of your fingernail to hear the ring, and then passing it out through the doorway to the waiting hands of your companion. The sound of the tiles ringing is a quiet music, each one producing a slightly different note depending on its size and thickness, and the notes mingle and overlap as you work, a soft, chiming rhythm that fills the kiln and spills out into the yard. The spaces that held the tiles apart during the firing have baked hard and brittle, and some of them crumble when you lift them away, scattering fragments of terracotta-colored clay onto the sand floor. You brush these fragments aside with your palm and continue lifting the tiles, moving through the rings in the reverse order of their placement, working from the center outward, from the top downward. The flat clay shells come out next, still hot and heavy, and you pass them through the doorway carefully, gripping them with both hands to avoid dropping them on your feet or your companion's hands. By the time you reach the bottom layer, the kiln is mostly empty, and the interior is a dark, circular space with sand on the floor and a few stray fragments of space are scattered around. The heat has faded further now, the bricks only slightly warmer than the air outside, and you feel the cool damp of the morning begin to seep in through the open doorway. You lift the last few tiles, tapping each one, and you are pleased to hear that every tile rings true except one, which gives a dull, flat thud when you tap it with your nail. You set that tile aside in a separate pile, the pile of seconds that will be ground up for grog, and return to the clay pits to become part of future tiles, so that nothing is wasted and the cycle of the clay continues unbroken. You step out of the kiln into the cool morning air, brushing the sand and the ash dust from your tunic, and you stand beside your companion and survey the delivery pallet. The tiles are stacked in neat, even layers, their warm terracotta color glowing softly against the gray of the sky and the dark green of the distant alder trees, and the stamped letters of the workshop mark are visible on the underside of every tile, a quiet, repeated signature that speaks of the care and patience that went into their making. The pallet is full and the kiln is empty, and the work of this firing is almost done. Now you and the other worker begin the sorting. You take each tile from the pallet, one by one, and you examine it in the grey daylight, turning it over in your hands and looking for any cracks or warps that might have been missed inside the dim kiln. The cracks are easy to spot, fine dark lines that run across the surface or along the edges, and the warps are revealed by laying the tile on a flat piece of stone and seeing whether it rocks or sits true. Most of the tiles are perfect, flat and true, and ringing with a clear, high note, and these you place onto the delivery stack that will be carried to the building site. A few tiles have hairline cracks, barely visible but enough to weaken them, and these you set aside with the dull tapping one, the small pile of seconds that will return to the earth. The sorting is a quiet, methodical task, and you perform it with the same calm attention that you bring to every stage of the work. Your hands move through the motions of lifting and turning and inspecting and placing, and your mind drifts into the same peaceful blankness that has accompanied you through the pressing and the trimming and the turning and the firing. The robin has moved from the drying shed to the fence post, and it watches you with its head cocked to one side, its red breast bright in the grey morning, and the smoke from the kiln chimney has thinned to a barely visible wisp, the last breath of the fire fading into the mist. When the sorting is complete, you take the cracked and flawed tiles and carry them to the grinding stone that stands at the edge of the yard, a large flat slab of granite with a smooth depression in its center. You break the tiles into small pieces with a tap of the iron hammer, and then you grind the pieces with a heavy stone pestle, working in slow circular motions that crush the terracotta into a coarse, gritty powder. This powder is the grog, and it will be mixed into fresh clay to give it strength and help it resist the shock of the kiln, so that even the broken tiles play their part in the making of new ones. The grinding is slow, repetitive work, and your shoulders begin to ache with the motion, but the ache is a familiar one, and you continue until the last piece of the broken tiles has been reduced to a fine, even grob that you scoop into a pottery jar and seal with a wooden lid. The morning has passed while you worked, and the grey sky has brightened by a few pale shades, though the sun is still a hidden smear behind the seamless cloud. The mist has lifted from the hollows, and the alder trees stand clear and sharp against the sky, their bare branches motionless in the still air. You carry the jar of grog to the clay pits and set it down beside the preparation table, where it will wait until the next batch of clay is mixed, and then you walk back across the yard to the main shed, your sandals making the same soft, wet sounds that they have made all day and every day. Inside the shed, you begin the work of sweeping. The broom is a bundle of birch twigs bound to a long handle, and it hisses softly against the beaten earth floor as you push it across the space, gathering the stray crumbs of dried clay and the drift of terracotta powder and the small fragments of straw and wood chip that have accumulated over the days of work. You sweep slowly, moving from the doorway to the back wall and back again, drawing the debris into a small pile in the center of the floor. The dust rises in a faint haze, catching the dim light and then settling, and you sweep it onto a flat wooden scoop and carry it to the clay pits, where you scatter it onto the path to fill the muddy spots, just as you have done many times before. The bench where you kneaded the clay and pressed the molds is next. You take a damp rag and wipe down the wood, removing the thin film of dried clay that has clung to the surface, and you work the rag into the corners and along the edges, cleaning away every trace of the work until the bench is smooth and bare. The paddle you wipe clean too, and you hang it on its nail beside the door, aligning it carefully with the shelf so that it will be easy to find tomorrow. The molds you carry to the shelf and stack in their neat pile, their sandy interiors still dusted with the last of the terracotta powder, and the bronze stamps you gather into their wooden box and slide the lid shut, the small letters of the workshop mark hidden away until the next pressing. The trough of clay is still covered by its damp cloth, and you check it one last time, pressing your fingers into the cool, elastic mass to feel that it is still moist and workable. The clay will keep under its cloth for another day, and tomorrow you will return to it, to wedge it and knead it and press it into the molds and begin the whole cycle again. And the thought of this does not weary you, but comforts you, because the cycle is what you know and what you are good at, and what fills the days with quiet, steady purpose. You wash your tools in the rain barrel, dipping each one into the cold, silvery water and scrubbing it with the rag until the clinging clay dissolves and floats away in cloudy swirls. The iron hammer and the wooden mallet and the bronze trimming strip and the cutting wire all go into the barrel in turn, and you dry them carefully with a corner of the rag and return them to their hooks and shelves, where they will wait in the dimness for the next time they are needed. The water in the barrel has grown murky with clay silt, and you know that it will settle overnight and be clear again by morning, the silt sinking to the bottom as the clay always does, patient and heavy and still. Now the shed is clean and orderly, the tools put away, the bench bare, the floor swept, the trough covered. You stand in the doorway and look back into the dim interior, and the sight is a quiet satisfaction, a sense of completion that has nothing to do with achievement and everything to do with readiness. The shed is ready for tomorrow, and you are ready for tomorrow, and the quiet rhythm of the tilery will continue as it always has and always will. You walk out into the yard and close the shed door behind you, pulling the wooden latch into place with its soft, familiar click, and you turn toward the path that leads back to the huts. The delivery pallet of finished tiles stands beside the kiln, its warm terracotta color muted now in the pale overcast light, and you pause beside it for a moment, resting your hand on the topmost tile. The tile is cool and smooth and hard, and it rings faintly under your touch, a tiny, almost inaudible note that vibrates up through your palm. And you think for a moment about the roof that these tiles will cover, the rain they will shed, the winters they will endure. The thought is not a proud thought, just a small, quiet awareness that your work will outlast you, that the tiles will still be keeping the weather out long after your own hands have returned to the clay from which they were made. You leave the pallet and walk to the gate, and the robin on the fence post watches you go with its bright, silent eye, offering no farewell except the slight bob of its head. And you walk out of the tilery and onto the field path. The path is the same pale ribbon of packed chalk and crushed earth that you have walked every morning and every evening for as long as you have worked in the tilery, and your sandals find the familiar dips and ridges without any need for your eyes to guide them. The grass on either side is bent flat by the morning's dew, and the mist is beginning to gather again in the hollows down by the brook, the same mist that you walked through at dawn and that you will walk through again tomorrow. The evening has not yet arrived, but the light is beginning to take on that softer, heavier quality that means the day is drawing toward its close, and the alder trees are dark silhouettes against the grey sky, their bare branches tracing delicate, intricate patterns that shift slightly as a faint breeze stirs the upper air. The brook gurgles in its unseen bed, the same sound it made this morning and will make tomorrow, and has made for centuries. And the crow calls once from somewhere across the fields, its voice a distant, lazy comment on the passing of the time. You walk slowly, your pace unhurried, your body carrying the pleasant heaviness of a day's work completed, your mind empty of any thought beyond the simple sensation of walking. The cool air on your face, the soft, wet sound of your footsteps on the chalk. The path rises slightly, climbing out of the hollow, and the mist thins around you, and the huts come into view ahead, their thatched roofs dark against the pale sky, their low doorways opening onto the green-grey expanse of the common ground. Smoke rises from a single chimney, a thin, quiet plume that bends slightly in the breeze, and the sight of it is as familiar to you as your own hands. You reach the door of your hut and pause for a moment, your hand resting on the rough timber frame, and you look back along the path toward the tilery. Though the tilery is now hidden by the dip in the land and the veil of the rising mist, its kiln and its sheds and its drying racks all folded into the grey, quiet evening. Tomorrow you will walk that path again, and you will take the clay from the pit and knead it on the bench and press it into the molds and trim the edges and carry the tiles to the drying shed and turn the older ones and check for cracks, and in time load the kiln again and fire it again and unload it again. And the cycle will continue, slow and steady and unbroken, as it has done since before you were born and will do after you are gone. But that is tomorrow, and tomorrow has not come yet. For now there is only the grey, quiet evening, the damp grass, the distant burble of the brook, and the low, dark doorway that opens into the warmth and stillness of the hut. You step inside and the door closes behind you with a soft wooden sound, and the tilery settles into its night, its tiles drying on their shelves, its smoke fading into the mist, its paddle hanging quietly on its nail, waiting for the morning when you will return and begin again. As you always have, as you always will.